Alrighty, so since we are in the sweet month of Halloween, I thought it relevant to explore the uses of horror in examining our contemporary social moment and consider its history as a genre of entertainment that both consistently repels us and compels us. Why do we as a society love horror? Horror is, from my perspective, the most versatile genre out there. You can explore so much, get as wacky and weird and as deep or contemplative and strange and stupid and outlandish as possible within the realm of horror, and still maintain a sense of belief while expanding imaginations and giving the girls a bit of a thrill, because the point of it all is to transgress. Fuck story convention, fuck sense, fuck objectivity. In fact, the more a horror story transgresses, the more likely audiences will seek it out as this daring, abject spectacle. Horror often acts as both a mirror and a window, reflecting and showcasing the perverse inversion of societal expectations, anxiety and perverse curiosity. I remember as a teenager, whenever I heard about a new horror movie coming out that scared people, I was always very curious. Again, it's almost as like a dare or a competition. Can you withstand the horrors of this new horror film? And especially if that new horror film was rated R. It just added to the curiosity even more, to the point that honestly, our badasses as teenagers snuck into some of these rated R horror films that we couldn't get into because, we were just innocent little children. But yes, we did. The temptation of the forbidden, uncanny, and whispers of terror within the latest horror film trend led to many happy transgressions in the name of a good scare. It's enticing, the presentation and the spectacle of horror that is made forbidden, particularly to the innocent and supposed sacred. But in terms of why we love horror, I can really only speak for myself. Ultimately, I love thoughtful horror that has a lot on its mind, horror with a compelling story, horror that lifts the veil and explores the dark depths of its horrific material in a curious frenzy. Not to take away from horror for horror's sake, because that has its thrilling merits as well, but for me, nothing is more stimulating than a horror film or TV show that aims to do more than just scare. But there's also plenty of horror that I enjoy that is bereft of social criticism or psychological exploration, or any sort of politic or intellectual backdrop. Not all horror media that I enjoy has to have depth to it. Sometimes the only depth a piece of horror media has is to give an entertaining scare that drags us out of the real-life horrors of the world and into some sort of escapist thrill. For example, much of the Saw series is fun or bad enough to be fun. But wait, I'm not talking about that more recent Saw shit that came out, I think, last year with Chris Rock and Samuel L. Jackson. That shit was fucking awful. I don't know what that was. We're just gonna act like that shit didn't happen and move right along. But yeah, there's plenty of just shock horror or campy horror that I like quite a bit. But for me personally, truly, the height of horror is, I guess, what people would call or refer to as elevated horror. Movies like Us, or Midsummer, or Mother, Saint Maud, Suspiria, the 2018 version, obviously. I go to the Saws and the sleepaway camps and the hostels and the things of that nature for some simple, brainless horror fun. However, I will say, or argue that films like Saw and Hostel or Sleepaway Camp also do have their cultural, social merits as well. You just have to dig a little deeper to find them, as they are more surface level and don't align well with overtly earnest criticism. But like with most horror films, you know what they are. They ain't trying to express too much other than to give the girls a good old time in the dark. But that just shows how horror is such a flexible genre, bending, mutating, and transmorphing into so many things with a diverse bevy of intentions, at once deciding to thoughtfully subvert, and at other times asserting its right to simple, exploitative frights. Humanity's obsession with horror spans way beyond the creation of visual media representation. But by the time it does reach the big screen, the aestheticization is already ripe with mutation. The horror genre spans so many different diverse subgenres throughout the world. It's no wonder how universally compelled we humans are by its ghastly representations of our fears. The first horror film is believed to be Georges Méliès's House of the Devil, or The Haunted Castle, a French horror film from 1896. And from there, a lot of early visual horror media focuses on ghosts and specters in the night, the undead usually depicted as skeletons. And also much of horror during those times drew from religious iconography and depictions of the devil. And apparently, because I'm not a regular viewer of older horror films, like stuff from the 1910s and 1930s and 1950s and shit, but apparently a lot of early horror had tinges of comedy or rather dark humor in them, up until, that is, studios began adapting gothic horror novels and stories with a more serious edge to them, gradually becoming more and more psychological and internal in their exploration of fear. Oh, and I'm sorry to be going through a short preliminary history of visual horror media, but I do think it's worth noting the progression of horror's lineage in the media, at least as we know it to be in the West, before we really dive into what we're here to really talk about, you know? But yeah, from there, critical and commercial success for horror, largely gothic horror, raised significantly in the culture and gave way to more extravagant horror films, such as creature features and monster movies like Dracula and Frankenstein. And as we get into the 1940s, visual horror saw a more reliance on tone and suspense and atmosphere until the 1950s, in which more campy sci-fi horror flooded the cinemas. And then the 1960s saw horror getting much more subversive and much more violent and giving way to more horrific social commentary. Slashers and gore fests and psychological horror grew all the way up into the 1970s, where snuff films also became big off of the fear of real-life serial killers. And from there on, horror's subgenres kind of exploded, with all kinds of horror being produced. A new sense of diversity in the expectations of what horror could be and do and ultimately say. Body horror became big, creature features came back in a big way, slashers became even more popularized, giving way to horror franchises like Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, and more Halloween sequels. Horror franchises in general really popped off like in the 1980s, especially with VHS becoming a thing for the first time, in which cult horror films really began to take shape in the culture, expanding the scope of horror even more. And the 1990s brought about more clever, self-aware horror a la Scream or I Know What You Did Last Summer, which played around with the tropes and expectations of horror conventions. And at the end of that decade and into the 2000s, found footage horror films became really big, with the Blair Witch Project, all the way to Paranormal Activity. Torture porn horror films also rose in popularity with projects like the Saw franchise and Hostel. The 2000s and on also saw Hollywood studios' obsession with remakes and reboots of old established horror classics. But thankfully, it didn't take too long before the, quote, more elevated and niche horror films and more niche horror took reign in the late 2000s and throughout the 2010s, all the way up until our present day. Now, all of that horror history packed tightly in one short historical recap for the sake of me lamely solidifying the reality that horror is a provocative, constantly mutating monster we won't ever be able to get rid of. Pandora's box has been officially opened, and we can't peel our eyes away from its ghastly contents. And mostly because we don't want to. Once the monster is out of the bag, it's hard to rip your eyes from the uncanny spectacle of its terrifying visage. There is something in the interstitial nature of horror that summons us to take a peek, to walk deeper into the dark, and there is a perverse pleasure in confronting that darkness. Something in human hubris needs to understand the monster and maybe even tame it, maybe even dominate it so that we can prove ourselves as righteously divergent from this dark entity that has inspired such fear. Again, it's the position of, is the hot new horror film as scary as the marketing says, or is it just another stale jump scare machine with bad acting? The possibility to connect to a primal source of possession, such as fear, is something of a dare made in the dark. Again, a dare to go deeper into the dark tunnel. Is the anxiety of the mystery worth it? What possibilities lie in this uncanny confrontation? What will it reflect back, if anything? When it comes to the question of what horror brings us in the real world, the answer tends to come down to a sense of community, as much of art does. But the way horror does it is especially special, and even sacred, yes, even in its perverse presentation. Like the spectacle of bearing witness to the uncanny, the voyeurism of watching people die horribly in outlandish ways, like in the Final Destination series or the Saw franchise, or really in most slasher films, it's actually a central aspect you can bet on witnessing in damn near any horror film, really. The physical distortion of the human body. And witnessing the destruction of the human body is so disturbing a representative symbol that it triggers shock. It's the obliteration of our foundational essence, literally the body. If it's ravaged and destroyed, what do we have? We don't even have we. So the horrific visualization of violence enacted upon the body and gore, it thrusts us into an existential dread that not only inverts everything, but obliterates everything, especially our sense of control and understanding of reality. And if the certainty of our reality is threatened, well, we're already on our way towards a horror experience. And as I think we spoke of in the last podcast episode, the great undoer of everything is death. The ultimate, most uncanny human mystery we all face throughout life and then eventually meet. So maybe, in a way, the stimulation of horror, especially in terms of the body or a lurking threat to the body, prepares us for that inevitable final confrontation. A simulated brush with the horrific existentialism of death allows us to explore the contours of its darkness, a flirtation with the unknown. We are in the great dark realm of transgression, and baby, there is a lot to be explored there. It's such great fun to get legitimately shook while watching a horror film or a television series, especially these days. Oh, and especially in a movie theater. The communal thrill of receiving a good scare while in the theater. Hoes be screaming and quaking in they loafers and shit. That communal element is solidified in the exploration of perspective in horror. Did you see that too? Did you hear the creaking noise in the corner, or am I just tripping? Jumping at noises and shadow figures in the dark, grasping your friend's hand in terror and laughing together after the initial fright. The consumption of horror brings people together in how its manifestation of fear inspires congregation and communion via perverse curiosity. A good old spectacle brings the girls together, and horror got spectacles for days. Or, you just might be a sedentary adrenaline junkie who is sensitive to the arousal transfer that comes from experiencing a horror film. The thrill of a good scare and the not-so-distant relief of being able to escape the nightmare. The stark dichotomy of the rise and fall experience of horror is stimulating to the body and mind. Cathartic, one might say. So, scientifically, it's just likely that we all just adore the satisfaction of escaping the nightmare, having control over the fearful possession we get through the horror simulation. Who's to say? I don't know. I don't know you. But also, there have been studies that show how watching horror films can help some people overcome their own real-world traumas. The horror film experience used as a kind of controlled exposure therapy, which is something that is used to treat a lot of people with anxiety disorders. Now, I haven't read those studies, so I can't speak to that, but I guess that wouldn't be all that surprising of a development. The adrenaline of a controlled scare and the eventual catharsis that can be found in the climax of most horror films, in which the horror protagonist, usually a woman, the final girl, beats the monster. A possible powerful practice of empowerment, perhaps. But altogether, why our society all over the world likes horror is an extremely subjective matter between all of us. I mean, y'all be up in the movie theaters getting spooked and then immediately laughing it off, trying to act okay, trying to be okay and shit. Trying to be okay in the darkness and horror of it all. Laughter? No. When I'm trying to get my scare, no, you will shut up. There will be no chuckling. There will be no laughter. You will sit there in your fright and allow me to sit there in mine as well. Scream and then shut the hell up. No giggles. No ma'am. But that incongruous laughter is often a defensive response that allows the audience to avoid the all-consuming conflict of the horrific confrontation. Now, angle that idea into how we as a people with real-life horrors and uncanny anxieties in our physical, empirical world, beyond the safety of film and television horror simulations and spectacles we all love and can't look away from. What do we do with those horrors? Because in the movie theaters, we be ready, baby. Bring it on, yes. When Nosferatu was first released to the anticipating public in, 1929? Y'all's ancestors was in the darkness of them theaters, pussy poppin' for that classic. Dracula too. Halloween with that animal in the William Shatner mask stalking and killing teenagers throughout the night. Just pussy poppin' in the movie theaters all over the nation in perverse celebration of the fantastical spectacle that horror brings to life. But in real life, the girls are hesitant to confront horror at all. And in many cases, understandably so. But that avoidance is often to the point that we complicitly allow ourselves to fall victim to lies and corruption, all for the sake of avoiding the very real horrors that haunt us, personally, socially, culturally, and politically. In this case, instead of the thrills of recreational horror bringing the girls together in curious communion, we fragment in anxious paralysis, insisting on our contentment with the dark, so long as we can't see the monsters that are out there. But in that darkness, we are much more liable to make the destructive mistake of misinterpreting each other, our communities, and potentially even ourselves as the monsters that haunt us rather than those who are pulling the puppet strings of fear. For example, there are many governing authorities that tend to imagine the worst of horror as an influencing poison that needs to be restricted or even banned. I mean, I remember when I was young and growing up, the concerns of how the violence and ghoulishness of horror media impacted the youth, or how it influenced people to act or think in immoral ways that would be reflected in real-life crime and deviance. That doubt and paranoia in society always astounded me. Like, it was to the point that even media like Harry Potter was turned into a book or a movie series that was teaching kids about witchcraft, and thus it was of the devil. This paranoia that horror media or anything to do with images or symbols or icons relevant to horror stories in pop culture, in popular culture, meant the devil was after us, that evil was finding ways to enter into the world through this scary content. And again, I do always encourage people to be critical about the media they consume, no matter what it is. But I do remember as a kid thinking that this fight for America's soul moralizing was always so unwarranted because the horror was fiction.
It's just a movie. It's pretend. You're an adult, you should know that.
But of course, when I was young, I didn't realize how fictional media impacted our reality. Now looking back, I realized how that panic around horror media when I was growing up was people using horror, or rather the fear horror inspires, as a form of social control. And the depravity and violence and transgressiveness horror revels in makes it an easy scapegoat. I mean, many people to this day, even some movie studios who make horror movies themselves, deem horror fans as these perverted weirdos who just like watching violence and monsters and gore. And sure, some people just do, for the hell of it. But there are all kinds of horror fans out there, many who are much more thoughtful in their consumption of horror than some would even expect. Like, I've met plenty of people who think that people who like horror are like these deranged, repressed psychopaths or sociopaths living out their deepest, darkest, most twisted fantasies through these horror simulations. And hey, I don't doubt that that could very possibly be true in some rare cases, but historically, it's more likely that those who loudly and proudly moralize around the horror genre's disregard for moral boundaries in regard to the sacred and the profane they are more liable to use their moralizing to instigate their own will onto the public more readily than a single horror film can even achieve. Interestingly enough, the paradox of movie making in general, be it horror or not, is that it's a communal art form that is also extremely capitalistic, just based on the way that filmmaking is regulated in our economy and within our institutions. In general, the paradox of transgressive art, like horror, being constrained within the soulless trappings of capitalism, a bit of a mess. But within that capitalist context, it makes sense that horror films are considered with less regard than others, the attacks of moralism used to critique genre. You know how horror films rarely, if ever, get any awards love. But horror has an audacity that not many other genres has as inherently. All good horror is demanding of its audience. Horror is confrontational in how it makes its audience literally look and dwell on the abject and the profane in challenging ways. Horror is designed to manipulate out of its audience strong reactions. The philosophies of capitalism in the hands of horror reflect back its uncanny monstrosities. It becomes inherently devoured and distorted as to illuminate the system's cannibalizing nature. So how could our system, compelled by the spectacle of horror, yet impassioned towards the practice of public condemnation and front-facing virtue signaling, fully embrace horror beyond its exploitative use as a transgressive cash cow that is milked and used as a salve for large budget film flops? It is rare for horror to get its due as a piece of art because of our system's definitive portrayal of horror as inherently niche, and also because of our society's moral pretenses. For some, the idea that anyone could take delight or perceive past the violence or disturbing imagery and find story and meaning is an affront. But really, I think it's a practice in cultural criticism. To remain fixed by the illusion of the monstrous is to remain paralyzed by its design. But to look and interrogate the depth of its meaning is a much more involving and courageous feat. We humans are used to possessing and controlling, grasping the logic of a story, but horror possesses and controls us via fear and dramatic anxiety in a way that jettisons our conception of logic. And that too can be a frustrating pressure point for many. But ultimately, the breakdown between horror fans and those who find horror so reprehensible and amoral that it ought to be censored and restricted, that dichotomic breakdown encapsulates a central social anxiety of which horror picks at like a scab.
Ew!
So, when confronted with horror media that, in its artistic pretense, reflects the practice of fearful distortion, it serves as a critique of our world and our normative perceptions. Are they as sacred as we deem them to be, based on the story we've been told, or is there more to the monstrosity than just fear? The way horror unpacks our easy perceptions is scary, because if we can't properly rely on what we've trusted up until this point to reflect back the truth, then we're in more trouble than we originally thought. And there are more monsters out this bitch than we know for sure. That thought alone is great breeding grounds for paranoia, doubt, insecurity, and suspicion. The breakdown of the unit and of reality is a sadistic invitation to chaos. Thus, the pretense is potent theory for reality. It's like, damn, we can't even leave the nightmare and be comfortable in the, quote, real world where it should be safe. And that's on some Nightmare on Elm Street type shit. That's the tension and release indicative of horror simulations, and if you don't get that release, that catharsis, the tension continues to haunt you. And I think also the things that scare us, our fears, have a tendency to take residency in our minds more than most other emotions. A horrific image or experience remains in the mind longer because of the permanence of terror. The trauma that horror infects the body with triggers the mind to grab onto something ordinary, something it can most easily make sense of as a defensive way to balance out the jarring experience of enduring horrific trauma. It kind of reminds me of an Annie Dillard essay called Total Eclipse, in which the author writes of a time when she took a journey to central Washington in order to witness a total solar eclipse, and how it led to a striking reevaluation of her worldly perspective. There's a moment in the essay after she witnesses the total eclipse where she and other spectators are in a diner, and Annie is still so bewildered by what she just witnessed, so, as I like to say, thrown to the wind, that she could barely express it in a cohesive or coherent way. She couldn't come up with anything, her grammar and lexicon obliterated by the immersive experience. That is, until one of her fellow spectators says, quote, "Did you see the little white ring? It looked like a lifesaver. It looked like a lifesaver up in the sky." And that knocks her awake, back to a tangible reality in which she is gifted these scattered tools of reason that work to give shape to the disturbance. Very similar to the ways the mind desperately grasps a hold of something to pull it back to some semblance of sense and reason after being confronted with a debilitating shock. The thing is, though, witnessing a total lunar eclipse, while a rare bewildering phenomenon, we do have science to make sense of it. The obliterative nature of horror-induced bewilderment, however, defies science. What use are our tools of logic if horror has the power to call on the deep, debilitating roots of human existential dread that we all share, fiendishly smashing our lovely lexicon of language and science, like kids smashing decorative pumpkins or jack-o'-lanterns? That corruption of reality and control dispossesses us from our world, and we are left in this never-ending cycle of trying to find our way back to it. Perhaps that's why horror films love to leave audiences with that final scare, one final jolt of horror to drive home the reality that maybe even after you thought you understood how to beat the monster, maybe you didn't truly understand it at all, and perhaps you've even made the horror worse for when it returns in the sequel, more terrifying than before. A repeated horror trope that adequately sets up for the tantalizing promise of more scary spectacles in the future. As such, there is a dedicated derivative repetition to the horror genre as well. Out of all of the genres, there seems to be damn near hundreds of horror genre tropes, and so many horror films and its subgenres maintain the familiarity of those tropes and story beats without shame, which is also perhaps one of the reasons why, as a genre, horror doesn't get the respect for its artistry that it deserves. Horror is a genre that more or less can be defined by its tropes, and they are usually very easy to spot. But many horror directors over the decades have proven that this bevy of tropes has a bounty of uses within the genre itself, and you can do so much with them to explore so much in so many innovative ways. Again, such is the mutating staying power of horror. I mean, horror sequels and franchises can easily become lazy cash grabs that install the horrific spectacle in stale amber, in which tropes and conventions are repeatedly consumed and regurgitated and consumed again, cheap tricks made on a loop. And yet still, the repetition and innovative mutation of familiar horror tropes and conventions maintains a power and ability to entice us back to the spectacle of the horrifying. Something in that accepted or maybe perversely possessive repetition of horror tropes speaks to contemporary studies regarding behavioral epigenetics, the study of how your behaviors and environments can cause changes that affect your genes. So like how inherited trauma can alter the way the cells in your body read your DNA. Quote, "Traumatic experiences in our past or in our recent ancestors' past leave molecular scars adhering to our DNA. Jews whose great-grandparents were chased from their Russian shtetls, Chinese whose grandparents lived through the ravages of the Cultural Revolution, young immigrants from Africa whose parents survived massacres, adults of every ethnicity who grew up with alcoholic or abusive parents, all carry with them more than just memories. And that genetic passing down of trauma experiences acts as an immersive repetition that affects our psychological and behavioral tendencies. So in a way, it's like the effects of trauma literally coded into our DNA, relaying deeply held historical anxieties, keeping the past alive in the present, much like a haunting. And in terms of the derivative nature that can easily be perceived within the horror genre, inherited anxieties around our human impulse towards easy normative categorization stay on the mind in evocative perpetuity, making long-held fears of deeper, darker complexities extraordinarily close. There goes that existential dread again, forcing us to interrogate our human obsession with order and neat, tidy dichotomies. Living, dead, human, inhuman, big, small, animate, inanimate, woman, man, black, white, light, dark. The list can go on and on and on. And perhaps it's the fact that the list can go on and on and on, much like the many distinct tropes of the horror genre, that makes the existential insecurity so potent and long-lasting. It threatens a complete and utter loss of control. And this speaks to a theory by psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan called jouissance, which, for those who don't know, means, well, on its basest level, kind of just gets at an exhilarating enjoyment or fulfillment of a deep sort of unconscious or repressed desire, similar to how horror purposefully transgresses. It kind of links to the idea of sexual orgasm on a certain level that is actually more about the build-up towards release than actual release, although this extends way beyond just the sexual realm. This is more about a visceral endurance of pain or suffering, unbearable tension, insatiable craving, unspeakable need that gives way to cycles of hedonistic catharsis. It's what makes horror almost pornographic in its transgressive audacity. Profane satisfaction found within the darkness of the margins type shit, you know? There is pleasure in trying to parse out the disturbing spectacle of horror films, deciphering the true killers, the real force of evil, the distortion, all in order to put together the clues that derive the truth of the defiant and uncanny, so that we can finally bridge the gap between the fiction and fact so as to gain that powerful sense of control again. It mirrors the exhilaration in taking the daring leap to transgress, to step boldly into the abject distortion that makes a mess of our sensical boundaries of acceptability, no matter the resulting consequences, which is usually symbolic monsterization. And within the confines of our real world, we know that willingly transgressing by giving into our deep libidinal desires has many social consequences, no matter how securing it may feel to us. Yet even still, the binary design that the human mind seeks out as a measure of order does not inherently dictate our desires, although we love to assume that it does, again, mostly because it gives us clean, neat, tidy options that gives us a sense of control and order, while also conveniently keeping us safe from the immensely demanding responsibility of freedom, which, contrary to how our community, our country, our society defines it for us, is so much more complex than just the ability or the right to have all the choices at our disposal. And in this case, I'm speaking about American society, obviously. Yes, my sweet country, 'tis of thee, indeed. To some, the aestheticization of horror hits far too close to those deep libidinal desires which represent an uncanny symbolic threat to the well-cultivated psychology of, say, the American national story, the American myths in order and social logic. It disrupts that defensive laugh that we give after the initial scare with a visceral reminder of the haunting that still lingers, giving way to a latent anxiety of what we and the world around us could and have historically been capable of when we reach outside the proper boundaries and borders of the sustained lie, of the protective performance, and of the invisible social contracts. Again, it's the doubtful, paranoid question of what will come as a cost for this transgression? How might it change us as a society or disturb our social progress if we dare to immerse ourselves in an experience that frightens us, that challenges our understanding of the world that we have established? And just like horror, the ideas of social progress are so subjective from person to person, from group to group, from demographic to demographic. So we're all in contention over what transgressions will be the tipping point of our fall from grace and civility and into that deep, dark well of horror and existential dread. And again, we can think about American society as it came to be. America's inception for a lot of people, for a lot of the world, is in fact a bit of a horror story. So the title American Horror Story, Mr. Ryan Murphy, is arguably kind of redundant. You could easily just say American Story and it still carries the same weight of that horror. The multitude of lies that this country has accumulated over time, the multitude of lies that this country is balanced on, is not sustainable, and as we see, it frequently results in a lot of chaos and confusion, the fragmentation of communities and realities that become so entrenched in the systems themselves that govern us that the diverse horrors that come as a consequence of that fragmentation seems insurmountable altogether. That is, unless we can present new horrors that supplant past horrors. It's kind of like, don't laugh, y'all, but Freddy vs. Jason. Y'all seen that movie? Basically, we're going to use this one horror to fight this other horror and hope that it all turns out well. But you know, it's still a bunch of horror and chaos and death and confusion and violence. Like, oh my god. So what are we really solving? Adding new horror to the reality of already existing horrors facing the nation so that we can continue to fight over which horror we're most able to live with? And again, given the wide divergence of perspectives on what is horrifying and what isn't, the consensus is rarely or peacefully found. I'll give an example for those of you who don't really know what I'm talking about. These budding draconian anti-abortion laws that aims to turn women seeking abortions into criminals who defile the sanctity of their supposed womanly duties. If a woman has the audacity to choose for herself to terminate her pregnancy, according to this new anti-abortion legislation that is being pushed in various states around this country, most notably in Texas, that act of autonomy alone makes the woman out to be a monstrous deviant who deserves to be subjected to punitive recourse under the eyes of our law. And this lawful contextualization distorts that woman's story and entire being into a source of horrific spectacle. Her body made a crime scene in which her story and humanity are obliterated in favor of the theatrics of horror regarding the hideous inversion of the motherhood role. These anti-abortion laws make it so that a woman acting on her freedom to relinquish the role of motherhood is tantamount to the transgression of murder. And it's those in power, largely men, using these notions of horror to enact social control over women's bodies and their reproductive rights. A woman relinquishing herself from those traditional values, for many, breeds paranoia. It's the breakdown of the family. Ooh. Because, you know, after all, what can a woman's story be beyond the prescribed social expectations of the heteropatriarchal narrative we have in place, and that is a boon to the machinations of our nuclear family system? This is similar to the anxiety that emboldened events like the witch trials. The mystery of change and transformation. What punishments will incur if we allow people to transgress beyond the logic of what we've defined as nature? That is, again, the powerful influence of transgression. It stirs the imagination because it begs the question, where will this transgression lead us? It can summon this paranoia that the fearful experience, in this regard, we're talking about, again, abortion, has the power to corrode us, to cause our destruction, and cause social degeneration, monsterization. And ultimately, I believe it comes from the doubt that we can communicate to our community and those around us our concern and make it real for them so that they can understand the weight of our perceived reality. And again, using our lexicon, our science and grammar language to construct a story, a sensical mythology beyond that abstract existential anguish is perhaps the best way we can relay our experiences to other human beings. That's why we tend to grasp concepts better when they are coupled with detailed examples, metaphors, and allegories. Stories, really. Which is, in turn, why fictional horror is regularly so mythical and calls attention to its theatrical elements, often birthed out of the history of a past perversely erupted into the present, as a haunting. The profane and the sacred are blurred, and thus the haunted protagonist is thrown into a world of the uncanny because they are still in their world, but it has now become a distorted depiction. There is familiarity to the geography, but there is a ubiquitous tension that harmony and comfort will be devastated by the eventual arrival of horror. The killer, the phantom, the creature, the devil, the alien, the blob, the werewolf, the whatever horror it is, it's going to once again make an attack on my reality. So it's kind of like the world is being slowly ripped out of classification. The boundaries of fact and fiction face corruption, and your once easy trust in others, your community, your friends and family, and the institutions that you've always blindly relied on is now thrusted into a fever dream where you wait in fear for the feature horror to reveal itself. So in that horror, the construction of mythology is again like a defensive laugh made after the fright. But the question is always, what is the purpose of that defensive mythology, that story? Simply to frighten for fear's sake? Is it to simply subvert the fear for your own personal peace of mind? Is it to enlighten and impart knowledge to others so they know how to overcome this horror? Or is it to instigate social control by leading with fear? The wild thing is that it can sometimes be a little bit of all of that, and potentially more. And it can always mutate throughout time. Who knew horror was so motherfucking complicated? But for us, when stricken with horror, it's like, do you even have the language to explain what's happening to you? To speak of the horrors that have possessed you with such paralyzing fear? And even if you do, can you articulate them in a way that is coherent and makes sense to others while in your terrified panic? Will others believe you, or will they leave you to the perils of dismissal? And if we're talking about the English language is an imperfect and very faulty way of trying to connect. I can't speak to the coherency of any other language, but the English language, it's about as articulate as the image of a ghost or monster in a dream when trying to explain the uncanny and the unexplainable. I've used the word uncanny a number of times so far, and it's a large part of what makes horror, real-life horror, and fictional horror work so well. And apparently the term uncanny was first used by a German psychiatrist named Ernest Gensticht in an essay from 1906. In German, uncanny is unheimlich, translated as unhomely, meaning something new and unknown that can often be seen as negative at first. Only for, that crackhead we know as Sigmund Freud to reposition the idea of the uncanny a bit as something that can be simultaneously familiar yet mysterious. Unheimlich was something repressed and hidden. Freud insists, quote, uncanny is in reality nothing new or alien, but something which is familiar and old established in the mind, and which has become alienated from it only through the process of repression. Distant yet disturbingly close. That class of frightening which leads back to what is known of old and long familiar. Those things that destined to remain hidden have nevertheless become manifest. So familiar subjects, foreign contexts, and potentially vice versa. And of course, as horror is, what is uncanny to us is always subjective. So this is very much in line with Lacan's theory of jouissance, the uncanny being a perfect stimulant towards jouissance. And this makes sense, seeing as how Lacan and Freud were contemporaries. But what does this have to do with the construction of language and story that can relay our horrific experience and the outlasting anxieties it summons? Well, I think the nature of being subject to an uncanny sight or experience is the entire essence of horror that disturbs our certainty of the world around us and pushes us into the darkness of the unknown, corrupting our tools of knowing, rattling our sensations, and inspiring a debilitating internal panic. An example Freud gives is that of the doppelganger, or the double, such as in Jordan Peele's film Us, which I remember him saying he was inspired to make after having horrifying random thoughts of a double of himself emerging from the darkness of an underground tunnel. Now for me, that thought alone is indeed pretty disturbing. A copy of me peering at me from the darkness of an underground tunnel? Uncanny. I mean, underground tunnels already disturb me a bit, so truly none of that situation would sit right at all. Truly debilitating. But that's a good example of an uncanny situation. Again, subjective, but for me, completely gripping. Altogether, just being confronted with a terrifying aestheticization or circumstance that knocks your words, your sense, your understanding of reality right out of you. In her book, Ghostly Matters, Haunting in the Sociological Imagination, Avery F. Gordon expands on the uncanny, stating, "Uncanny experiences are haunting experiences. There is something there and you feel it strongly. It has a shape, an electric empiricity, but the evidence is barely visible or highly symbolized. So naturally, that presents a challenge in assembling the right language that can adequately allow the construction of defensive myths that will attempt to make sense of the horror experience, again, real or imagined." Basically, what we're talking about here is the uncanny experience as haunting phantoms of trauma, and horror is the impetus of trauma. And how hard is it for us to express to another how our trauma grabs a hold of us and deeply affects us? So hard that most of us require a therapist to even get to the point of being able to put words to the viscerality of that experience. And actually, one could say trying to express an uncanny experience is just like trying to express the experience of feeling immense pain. How both experiences can immediately throw us into incoherent wailing and crying and screaming, and maybe even into a catatonic spell. Similarly, embodying the challenge of the uncanny, writer Elaine Scarry notes in her book, The Body in Pain, how isolating the experience of physical pain can be, stating, "When one hears about another person's physical pain, the events happening within the interior of that person's body may seem to have the remote character of some deep subterranean fact, belonging to an invisible geography that, however portentous, has no reality because it has not yet manifested itself on the visible surface of Earth." She continues, "Physical pain does not simply resist language, but actively destroys it, bringing about an immediate reversion to a state anterior to language, to the sounds and cries a human being makes before language is learned. To be a person witnessing someone else struggling as they have a nightmare or freaking out about a phantom that you can't see, it makes that person experiencing the horror suspect right off bat and due for interrogation and doubt, because for the spectator, the distance between the victim's very real reflex from horrific stimulation and their interior experience has broken the simplicity of our harmony. And if you can't share that person's interior experience of an uncanny nightmare, it tests your comprehension and your patience. I think that's also why we don't do well with mental illness in our society, which is also reflected in the often problematic depictions of the mentally ill captured in many horror films. It's like we can't see and make empirical sense of what is bothering the mentally ill person. We can only see the symptoms of their suffering that others them. And again, the peril of dismissal arises. I can't understand your experience. It's unreal and otherworldly to me. And that position regularly makes a monster, or at the very least, a dehumanized creature out of the victim struggling with the mental illness. And for most, that is reason enough for the incomprehensible victim to be sequestered away from the rest of normal society. Shit like that happens regularly in horror films. The inability of the horror protagonist to get those around them who are oblivious to the horror to believe them and understand them, they are usually institutionalized and considered a danger to themselves and others. It produces confusion that makes us feel so distant from those who are actually so close, and instead pushes us nearer to the wide scope of fear that solidifies our doubt. It's that sort of, am I in a nightmare or am I awake to reality sort of doubt. Again, that Nightmare on Elm Street type shit, that kind of paranoid doubt that makes a potential monster out of everyone and can easily make the person seized by paranoid fear seem crazy or monstrous themselves. That's the kind of potent doubt and anxious exasperation that can distort our neighbors, our communities and even our families into monsters that often lead us to behave monstrously in order to, quote unquote, save and tame them, to make them supposedly sacred in our eyes again, because the horror has made them profane. There is so much of that doubtful impulse spirited by fear and the inability to connect to another person's experience that permeates within our conception of social order and law, especially our laws around identity and how our identities have ascribed expectations in social scripts. And much of those expectations in social scripts we adhere to every day may not necessarily be laws, but they are like social contracts that we agree to for the benefit of each other and collectively upholding the lies that shield us from the true haunting horrors lurking in our periphery. And again, I'm speaking of the real world horrors that we let run amok in our society. Instead of grabbing and embracing each other in fear and reassuring each other that we did indeed hear the creak in the floorboard and caught sight of the ghostly shadow undulating in the corner, we deny the presence of the horror altogether in hopes that we will all take cue and fall into passive complicity, that none of us will call attention to the nation's degeneration, and that hope is often even to the point of denying each other clarity and definition so that we can instead secure ourselves. And that mutual withholding of social validation is a haunting circumstance in and of itself. Because, at least a scream could translate that something is wrong, but the social contract that indoctrinates us into a cult of denial and deceit in favor of more familiar and distant horrors we've learned to either digest with gritted teeth or selectively forget breeds an atmosphere of insincerity and confusion, often leading to that, good old chaos and social fragmentation. Historically and personally, the source of a lot of deceit and fronting social performance comes from cycles of trauma, again circling us back right around to America. This country as a whole is the type of greedy, desperate liar that lies habitually in order to reinforce past foundational deceptions to the point of outright absurdity, mostly because, again, we want to protect and preserve our access, our rights, to all of the options that protect and preserve us. Underneath the well-constructed national facade, the mythical American dream runs on jouissance, chasing the promise of ultimate satisfaction that was never real in the first place. I mean, this hard patriotic American nationalism that many Americans praise and uplift can certainly be seen as a form of strategic lying and mythical delusion, because, we just can't be out here the suited and booted moral authority of the world by sharing our fears, anxieties, and insecurities. That just comes off as vulnerable and weak. And we red-blooded Americans over here, baby. What do you mean? Even though it's like, okay, everyone else is red-blooded too. But alright. But instead of working to reconcile the horrors that give way to the lies that spread even more horrors, we've adapted to the lies and must instead drape ourselves in the American flag, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights, all to cover up the blood, bruises, and carnage, the physical, empirical signs of the national haunting that compels us to construct nationalist mythology atop the graves full to the brim of bodies slain, abused, and exploited and crushed so that this empire could be. Hell, we'd zombify the motherfuckers and crush them again if we had to. That kind of sacrificial violence speaks to the commonplace cowardice that weighs on the American conscience. Not calling all Americans themselves, ourselves, cowards, but more so insisting how we have historically, generation by generation, inherited the impulse to forget. How we have been heavily incentivized and systematically coerced into forgetting and neglecting the horror that is much of our national history. And also that adamant neglect is to our collective detriment. After all, the precarious definition of American identity would not be so precarious if that haunting did not compel us to avoid the reality in favor of the myth. Again, we live in a nation that loves to play moral superior daddy of the world, the horror protagonist, the final girl, but look at the carnage piled up in our backyard, while we over here pointing to the dysfunction happening in other countries, especially in supposed third world countries. When really it's like, bitch, you ain't the final girl. You're the killer. But you're the motherfucking killer in the mask. You're Michael Myers. As if we haven't had a hand in the international destabilization that makes dysfunction so pervasive via our imperial agendas. Of which, by the way, have been very serious sources of horror for many other nations, again, especially those nations we like to call Third World. To explore the bloody, disturbing expanse of horror perpetuated by America's hand and get to the real root of it, that mirrors the normative journey of the actual horror protagonist, of the actual final girl, who must scour the hideous underbelly of this horror's history to find ways to grasp at the root and extract the mutating rot, to exorcise the demonic possession out of the site of diabolical infestation. But it is often that space of horror is instead exploited, weaponized really, by those in power as the reason why we should not grasp at the root or even criticize it. And they do so by reflecting that horror back at the people as fear and shame, which, as we know, is truly a global tactic regularly used by the powerful to control the masses, even again to the point of chaos, confusion, and fragmentation, which is without a doubt reflected in our present day. This is the mass manipulation that makes the majority of us habitually afraid of critically observing the source, the complicated roots of our social, cultural, political troubles. And we know that the political is always personal. So that's work that often requires us to unearth haunting details of the past in order to exorcise the demons of the present, so that we may actually have a chance at a tangible future instead of this abstract concept of one that we love to use to perpetuate and justify the many horrors that haunt us in the present day. One of the more recent art house horror films that has become an all-time favorite of mine is the 2018 remake, or rather reinterpretation, of Suspiria. I love that bonkers ass fucking film. I remember I first went to go see it with my mother in a little movie theater in Nashville. I was shook. I know she was shook because I was shook. I wasn't ready. We both were not ready. But truly, after viewing it twice more and fully digesting Luca Guadagnino's vision and the dark contours of the film, it was impossible for me not to love, because it does everything a good horror film ought to, for me at least. It's actually pretty dense in its haunting and historical implications and observations about the violent, oppressive roots of fanaticism and demagoguery. But the element I find most haunting about this film is how it captures the nature of how the powerful make concerted efforts to cover up sins of the past by incentivizing the populace into forgetfulness via social and political illusion. Not unlike how the witches of the Marcos Coven at the Tance Dance Academy manipulates the young dancers in their company and under their apparent motherly care, these dancers are instead sources of power to be exploited, crushed, and maimed if need be, but ultimately they are collected as a sacrifice for the maintenance of the powerful. Even Susie, the main protagonist of the film who effectively disassembles the coven, in an effort to set things right and to promote balance, she purposefully goes to Dr. Klemperer, one of the main victims of the coven's unwieldy dominance, in order to impart to him the gift of forgetting the horrors that he has suffered. It's played as an act of compassion, and it is in a way, but it also perhaps inadvertently plants the seeds of discord for the future in which those she blesses with forgetting are liable to fall into the same pitfalls and defensive impulses that originally led to these horrors in the first place. Any period of horror, or any period of darkness, tears, and sighs, will inevitably come to an eventual end, no matter how potentially gruesome that end might be. Thus, Mater Suspiriorum, the mother of sighs, reaching the end with a sigh of momentary relief. But from there, how can we as a society properly move on from one hideous end of an era and rebuild towards a better future with the intention to avoid the horrific trappings of the previous era, if we have at every turn incentivization to forget and to uphold these convenient social contracts and to abide by new stories, new myths, new interpretations, all in an effort to keep the reality of those ghostly matters at bay. One of the lines from Luca Guadagnino's Suspiria that really stuck with me when I first saw it is when Susie tells Dr. Klemperer, "We need guilt, doctor, and shame, but not yours," right before she casts the spell that allows him to forget all the horrors that he suffered at the hands of the corrupt coven. It again speaks of Lacan's theory of jouissance, in which the cycles of want from pleasure to suffering goes on in perpetuity. Suspiria, like the theory of jouissance, implies that the cycle of purposeful avoidance and forgetting, particularly of the paralyzing fears of our history, is a natural human impulse, which I think is true, given the evidence of history, and that just kind of speaks to the enduring folly and enduring hope that both conflicts and propels the human spirit. We certainly are, annoying as creatures of contradiction in that way, aren't we? The blessing and curse of our human conscience, perhaps. Balance and harmony can be restored for a time, but because that inclination to forget and neglect is so strong and so systematically ingrained, because the want to hold on to simplicity is so universally potent, especially after an era of darkness ends, new cycles and iterations of horror, social, cultural, and political, will always resurface like mutating zombies rising from the grave, even more uncanny in its haunting, recontextualized familiarity. And this is why Suspiria is a forever timely film that uses heightened operatic horror tropes to explore how real-life terror runs on repeat in our world. Now, in the classic that is All About Love by Bell Hooks, in her chapter on honesty, she observes how we are primed from youth to be implicit and complicit liars from the jump. She writes, "How many of us can vividly recall childhood moments where we courageously practiced the honesty we had been taught to value by our parents, only to find that they did not really mean for us to tell the truth all the time? In far too many cases, children are punished in circumstances where they respond with honesty to a question posed by an adult authority figure. It is impressed on their consciousness early on, then, that telling the truth will cause pain, and so they learn that lying is a way to avoid being hurt and hurting others. Both men and women learn to lie from an early age after realizing that the truth often leads to harsh consequences, punishment, disappointment, and pain. Basically, we learn from a young age to associate fear of personal horror around the concept of honesty. Contrary to the platitudes adults tell children all the time about the moral uprightness of being honest. And it's in that conflicting liminal space between virtuous words and deceptive actions that the notion of honesty becomes a source of chaos and terror. Furthermore, Bell Hooks notes, those who learned to tell polite lies or say what grown-ups wanted to hear always were more popular and more rewarded than those of us who would speak the truth. And that dynamic certainly persists and grows as we grow into adults, in which our ability to assimilate into the historical, social, cultural lies and performances become indelibly attached to our necessity and social self-preservation. It's a delicate dance, these performances of pretense, but again, we learn the value and use of them from a very young age. Quote, "Since pretense is such an expected aspect of childhood play, it is a perfect context for mastering the art of dissimulation. So childhood play slowly mutates into this practice of convenient deceit, of evading the monster of honesty by seeking out power and dominance via lies and performance. Maybe this is also why so many people are so deeply creeped out by children in horror films. I mean, children, after all, remain in that chaotic and delicate liminal space between their unwieldy imaginations and the harshness of reality that we generally like to conceal from them. And much like horror itself, much like the uncanny, their sort of interstitial state between innocent and sacred youth and knowing profane adulthood can threaten to undo our own certainties about our reality, flippantly subverting our role as the all-knowing parent or adult guardian by questioning the nature of the world, the whys, those pesky why-type questions that children love to ask, that call attention to the horrors of the world most of us would rather avoid and not talk about, especially with young children who earnestly want to know. But it is our job to get children ready for the real world, for adult life, to help find answers to their simple and difficult why-type questions. And as Bell Hooks speaks truth to, unfortunately, it is more often that we impart to them the implicit and complicit adherence to social performances and deceits that negate the horrors that we know very well exist in the real world. Sugarcoat the bullshit with pretty little lies to preserve our own sense of control and order, but insist we're doing so to preserve our children's innocence. Again, it reminds me of how the Witch Coven in 2018's Suspiria uses ideology and this communal idea of a family of curious artists to cloak more self-servicing intentions related to gaining and consolidating power, domination, and influence. Also reflecting how children are the site in which most of us can freely act out our own power and dominating influence upon. And really, this is how casual trauma and the proliferation of personal and social horrors are consistently dispersed throughout our society, passed down generation to generation as a collective. It's a possessive societal influence, and it's so normal, yet so cyclically destructive. The thing is that truth, as we know, is inextricably linked to the path towards justice and accountability. The thing that is so scarce around here these days. And also we know that justice and accountability are essential components to the facilitation of love. So how can we possibly be a loving culture, an accepting culture, the United States of America, if we can't even explore truth that would allow justice that then facilitates the love necessary to be a caring, humane, and civil society, no matter how uncomfortable or horrific that truth is? Not that we ourselves as individuals can't make the efforts and put in the considerable labor to do so within our own personal lives and relationships. I mean, that's certainly possible. But when the society you live in is so divergent to that practice, when our culture of convenient deception teaches people to lie and perform from such a young age and associate trauma with the truth, it's more likely that most of us internalize the nature of that pretense first and foremost. Meaning, how do you even have a true sense of self for yourself, let alone the world around you? These lies distort and confuse our reality to the point that it becomes difficult to tell the difference between the lies and the truth, the root and the myth, the fact from the fiction. At some point, it's like, damn, how can we even be sure when to be true in our own self-expression, or when to lean into the performative impulse to lie so as to keep up appearances and maintain social graces? So all of that said, it's no wonder we have a culture that so consistently struggles with justice and accountability, as well as accessing vulnerability required for giving and accepting love. Because what does Cornel West say? Justice is what love looks like in public. And again, I'm gonna keep reminding y'all, and mostly myself, those struggles around justice, accountability, and consequently love are personal, social, cultural, political, and of course, historical. The purposeful negligence of truth results in the breakdown of justice and accountability, which, as we've discussed ad nauseum, is the breakdown of the community. And community is imperative in confronting that historical horror, much like the community of Haddonfield in that new Halloween film, Halloween Kills, which is absolutely god-awful, by the way. It's really, really bad. Really... I mean, it's funny. It was so bad that it was so funny. But here it's useful as an example to prove my point. The community comes together in an effort to finally kill Michael Myers.
Evil dies tonight.
Evil dies tonight!
Evil dies tonight!
All right, evil dies tonight! Evil dies tonight!
Okay, girl, bye. Bye.
But unfortunately, the fuckers fumble because they allow their anguish and fear to delude them into seeing what they want to see, contributing to an atmosphere of confusion and chaos that, as you may have guessed, ushers in more social horrors and social degeneration that leads to the horrific death of an innocent, mentally ill man who somehow they mistake as Michael Myers. Okay. Literally the horror of it all. The convenient lie makes monsters out of them all, and this conquest is a means to heal the community and rectify the history of terror the town is faced, but ultimately they embody that terror in a way that makes the community even more dangerous and susceptible to traumatic horrors.
Congratulations, you played yourself.
You know, we love saying no cap, but it seems to be full cap, and full cap only. We prefer the convenience of the lie. And hey, I'm indicting myself in this bullshit as well. We all participate in it, and that makes us all susceptible to taking on the role of a Michael Myers, becoming the mindless totem of terror instead of the righteous fighter, Laurie Strode, who we all like to believe ourselves to be. To put the labor into living opposite of the normative stasis of the herd is a lot of work that requires constant diligence, constant self-reflection, constant critical thinking, and a continued development of our emotional intelligence. And it's a process that never ends, because the national and social lies are always being reinforced and innovated upon, the powerful insatiably hungry for our validating loyalty and allegiance. You know, I'm always interested in how these normative lies and performances manifest themselves physically, within or upon the body. Like for me, personally, there was a time in which I could give off fantastic fake smiles and performative laughs and performative conversation with people, you know, do the usual social performing that we all do. But I can no longer do that, or at least not to the height that a majority of us are expected to. It's kind of like my body won't allow me to do that anymore as I've gotten older. I'm speaking as if I'm an old ass bitch. I mean, I feel like in spirit I'm old as fuck, but I'm physically quite young.
Lies, lies, and more lies, and lies on top of lies.
But anyway, yeah, I can't really easily give into those social performances like that anymore. It's kind of like my body rejects that. I just can't. And if I do, or find myself in that position in which I fall back into upholding those social lies and performances, I notice that it takes a lot out of me. I get easily fatigued and lethargic, and I get brain fog, and in the worst case scenario, sweat and my stomach turns, and I fiddle and pick at my skin or my body, and anxiety. My eyes get bloodshot. It's almost like the lie of those social performances threatens to turn my body into a site of horror. So it's kind of like, is the lie of social performance and disingenuous niceties worth it if it takes so much out of the body to sustain? No. But that kind of personal resistance can also make people uncomfortable when you don't validate the societal lie, when you don't uphold that social contract of those disingenuous niceties and social performances, because then you're calling attention to the nature of the dysfunction and the buried horrific source of that dysfunction, either within themselves or within their external reality. And that kind of puts you in the position of being radical or rebellious, deviant to some people, in which you can become damn near monstrous in their eyes because of your divestment from the social performances we're all expected to practice and uphold together. You've strayed from the herd, and that gives way to suspicion. But it's like, to some people, actually to lots of people, those social lies and performances are the distressing manifestations of the root of the dysfunction, chaos, and horror that affects their personal lives, and that weathers them, and that manifests itself within their physical being. And this is kind of why a lot of people don't like protests or protesters or activists, because you're calling attention to the ugly root of the horror that makes us reflect on the distressing reality that we are all complicit in said horror. We gotta shut y'all the fuck up. To the point that people will literally run down protesters and activists in the street, and to the point that politicians and lawmakers will present laws in which it is legal for people to run down protesters and activists in the street. That's how deeply entrenched the horror is, that it abides the human creation and supplementation of new horrors to avoid the true root of the horror people are calling attention to via the protest in the first place. And truly it's a disgusting perversion of our human ability and impulse to create that is spurred by manipulated fear instead of a curiosity for enlightenment and self-expression. A protest throws a deeply radical reality in your face, unveiling the deeply embedded horror that's baked into the system. And a great majority of us don't want to face that horror, especially if it places us in the position of the complicit perpetrator, and if it's not in the controlled space in which we have the option to look away or walk away. And especially not if it uproots our way of life and our simplicity. That avoidance creates a society that lies as a protective pathology that allows us to retain, again, all of the options that preserve our position, our power, our privilege, our dominance. I mean, we are in a time in which people want institutions of education to avoid teaching children the reality of how this country was built up and continues to sustain itself via the constructions of race and racism. We live in a time in which scamming seems to be at an all-time high, in which the spread of misinformation and disinformation is a source of social and reality control, in which lying to maintain one's position is the name of the game. It's why we love and hold dear to our Disneyland version of American optimism and patriotism that insists that the past is the past and has no effect on the present, so be happy and move forward, no matter who we're trampling on in order to do so. And even though the horrors of the past keep seeming to repeat themselves with new uncanny iterations that keep us from evolving towards a better future. Once again, I'd certainly call that a haunting. Moving forward but stuck in the past, it's like running in the dark through a pitch black cave, stepping forward into nothingness, bumping into things and tripping over things, unable to make progress because we keep mistaking the cover of darkness as the thing that will save us from confronting the monster, instead of the thing that keeps us paralyzed and trapped in the cave with the monster, where we too adapt to that monstrous shape and logic. Much more difficult to come to the light and see the monstrous reflection is our own. That kind of self-reflection on a personal level and a societal level is not for the faint of heart. And it's because those in power have the resources and reach to weaponize shame and fear so potently and expansively, while also instilling a cultural attitude of punitive catharsis, that the impulse to lie and cover up to preserve is so ingrained in all of us. Again, since youth. It keeps us obedient and deferential to the horror instead of righteously defiant against it. Keep the populace frightened to the idea that they will be made deviant and monstrous in the eyes of the people they love and in the eyes of society in general. So much so that they will become unlovable, undeserving of human empathy and consideration and community, that their relationships will crumble, that their image, their reputation, and legacy that they have spent years cultivating for themselves will be destroyed if the root of the lie is unearthed and studied and critiqued. It's this fear of what will we have then if we are thrown into the light, naked and vulnerable, our imperfections bare for all to see. How will we be judged, and what horrors will that judgment subject me to? These are rather loaded existential questions, aren't they? The scary ones most of us would rather not dwell on at all. Which makes sense. I mean, speaking of Freud, his pleasure principle is all up in that desire to avoid things that make us squirm. It's a branch of the human survival impulse. And even in my criticism, I can't lie, the cultivation of societal lies is understandable in some way, as some people have more room and privilege to be able to live their truths more fully than others, right? Some people are deferential to the lie in order to survive. In fact, I think a great majority of us preserve the lie just in order to survive, because in some cases, truth can get people killed or harmed in physical, psychological, emotional, and monetary ways. This is unfortunately the nature of the horrors that are perpetuated in our society and in the world. Truth can haunt just as much as a well-constructed lie can, and inspire all kinds of spirited reactions for better or worse. And it's difficult to be honest about hard, uncomfortable, often even horrific truths with people who prefer the comforting shield of the lie. no matter how thin that shield ultimately is, because often we have to keep reinforcing it with lies to the point that that shield becomes so heavy we can barely lift it to protect ourselves anymore. We're clumsy with it, suffocated by it. And guess what? It shows. From the outside looking in, the shield itself begins to look monstrous and uncanny. We've lied our way to monstrosity, only exacerbating the already existing horrors and anxieties that instigated the lying in the first place. Fear, or at least its foundations, are damn near everywhere in our society here in America, and yet we are always told not to consider the historical and political roots of how that fear is used to contort us. And so much of this makes me wonder if we have an almost instinctive impulse, or maybe even pathology, towards horror media because it most confrontationally aestheticizes those repressed fears more than any other genre. The search for meaning in the strange and unknowable has us constantly confronting darkness, our own and the world around us, facing the uncomfortable reality that maybe our tools of control, civility, and order ain't really cutting it, isn't enough to save us from the haunting. And this is why darkness is and will always be horror's sharpest weapon. Meeting the mirror of darkness is not a comforting sight. Darkness blurs and distorts our certainty, blotting out our world, disrupting our ability to understand what we are experiencing, making a mockery out of our sensations, and being alone in the dark with something stalking, haunting, and hounding you is the ultimate dread that again embodies the existentialism of death. I mean, that's kind of similar to when you're having a nightmare, or when you're in the darkness of a movie theater thrown into a fictional horror story. When you are in the dark viewing a horror in a theater and return to the light of day. Is it not like awakening from a nightmare that made a transgressive, formless mess of the world you know to be reality? But hey, now you're back, awake and safe in your bed, but still in the body that experienced that horror, still in the cold sweat from the horror of the simulation, even knowing that it wasn't atopia fiction. And we know that for people who have night terrors, their experiences have very real consequences on their lives, their sleep, and possibly even their mental health and personal relationships. They themselves become the embodied victims of an uncanny experience taking place in a liminal space of horror within the mysterious and contradictory confines of our reality. And perhaps this might explain why I love A Nightmare on Elm Street so much. It deconstructs our conceptions of reality to get to the true source of distortion and horror. Freddy Krueger,
Think you're so smart, huh, bitch?
He's merely a mascot compared to the real-life horrors that give way to his grisly form. It's the first horror film that I saw that showcased how we can use horror to unpack relevant social topics, a last-ditch effort to make sense of the horrors found in the dream. The mounting pressure to survive the horror, the uncanny, the monster that facilitates the breakdown of civility and community, the message of isolation wins out and everyone else becomes a potential monster. I can't trust you. What if you're a monster lying in wait, ready to turn my dream into a nightmare? Fuck off. How ironic that the existential darkness of horror has the power and versatility to explore and bring so much to light. We just have to be as bold in our transgression as the horror film itself. And in horror's boldness, we can gradually become bold too. And honestly, I think my love of the horror genre is partly why I love cultural criticism and psychology and sociology and in general the study of pop culture and society so much. There's a lot of progressive potential in horror. I mean, again, we adore the aestheticization of watching protagonists vanquish imaginary monsters and killers and ghosts and demons or whatever by assembling wisdom and knowledge and gradually overcoming fear. It's one of the most empowering forms of media catharsis out there. Again, it demands an immersive experience from its audience in ways few other genres can even touch. The development of history, the slow burn that I know some of y'all don't really have the patience for, but for me, I love. I want to know and spend time immersing myself in the context. After all, it gives the scares, the horror, more weight when you've taken the time and patience to study the details. It's an important part of the immersive experience, setting the tone, the atmosphere. I mean, that's what makes an effective scare after all. The meticulous attention paid to the textured, detailed, purposeful setup. The holding of that tension that grips you with dreadful anticipation. In that way, the nature of a well-crafted scare in a horror film is really like a masterclass in how to be better, more diligent and brave spectators of our own history. And that is the foundation of the proper practice and prayer of media and art consumption anyways, a reflection or meditation after the dream, or, in this case, after the nightmare. That's the constructive use of horror, tilting the image to examine its dimensions from all sorts of angles, from new perspectives that we might have never even considered if not confronted with its uncanny posture in the first place. Viewing, studying, and diligently critiquing that liminal space where the deconstructive power of fear splits reality, the root, and fiction, the myth, and allows us to extend our minds and engage our curiosity so that we can constructively confront the conflict. Much like Annie Dillard after witnessing that life-changing total eclipse, we are reminded that, quote, the mind wants to live forever, or to learn a very good reason why not. The mind wants the world to return its love or its awareness. The mind wants to know all the world and all eternity and God.
Wow.
And sometimes it takes the experience of existential obliteration via the shocking immersion of horror to bring us back to the root of why we're here in the first place. To explore and embrace each other in the perilous journey of that exploration. Critical thinking and communion. That is the true power of horror. The first film I want to get into is a straight-up horror with its own legacy, and that film is Nia DaCosta's Candyman. I don't know why it took me so damn long to finally watch this film. I've literally been anticipating it since I heard Nia DaCosta would be directing. I really enjoyed her first film, her first feature, Little Woods, so I wanted to see what the good sis was working with in resurrecting this horror classic for the new age. But somehow, I guess because of how COVID derailed a lot of releases for films, this one got kind of lost in the shuffle for me. But how appropriate for me to finally watch it during the Halloween month. I was excited when I first heard of this new articulation of Candyman, this iconic horror, because it did bring something close to childhood nostalgia. Because truth be told, I watched the original Candyman when I was like, 8 or 9 years old. Again, should not have been watching it that young, but I did. And it did indeed scare the hell out of me for like months. Now, out of all the horror films I watched too young, that was probably the main one that I did regret watching at my tender, young, innocent age. But truly, the horror of the original Candyman remains legitimately chilling to me. Again, I saw it when I was too young, but even when I rewatched it some years later, I still found it potent in how frightening it was. Just the entire nature of the story, fully transgressive and deeply, deeply evocative. I mean, the mirror game itself encapsulates one of horror's most useful tools, suggestion. You're transgressing by taking part in this dark dare and in saying this name. It's literally like a summoning of something. Will it come and frighten you to death, or are you just freaking yourself out? I love that element. That's part of the fun. Again, dark transgression. I haven't seen the original Candyman in some years, and I don't recall ever seeing any of the sequels, so I'm not really invested in comparing. I'm just taking this 2021 iteration as it is and going from there. This is basically a fourth installment in the Candyman saga, not a remake like I somehow thought it was, but a synopsis for 2021's Candyman, and I'm taking this from IMDb. A chance encounter with an old-timer exposes Anthony to the true story behind Candyman. Anxious to use these macabre details in his studio as fresh grist for paintings, he unknowingly opens a door to a complex past that unravels his own sanity and unleashes a terrifying wave of violence.
Candyman. The urban legend is, if you say his name 5 times while looking in the mirror, he appears in the reflection and kills you.
Who would do that?
Candyman. 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 Candyman.
First off, this film pointedly has its hand on the pulse of contemporary conversation regarding anxieties around the production of black art that explores the horrors black people have faced throughout American history. And I like the way that the film used the idea of evocation to build dread and anxiety around what the immersion in those horrors could possibly summon, as the original did in a different way. Here it's through the lens of black art, which, as we know, is a prized commodity these days, and with good reason. There's so much black talent out there being discovered and finally put on, which is giving us new access to new angles within the black perspective. Yet still, the means of production stem from largely white-operated production companies and curators who control what mass audiences see. And as we discussed earlier, movie making and media is still an immensely capitalist endeavor. And the production of black art is still largely in the hands of the white supremacist economy built off the backs of our black ancestors and the systematic violence that still reverberates to this day. And as such, that contextual paradox of black perspective versus white power structures presents a troubling anxiety that is reflected in real-world discussions about the rising popularity of black art consumption, especially as it relates to black horror. The vampiric nature of whiteness in America has a long history of mindlessly consuming black cultural products and expressions. So in terms of this recent popular rise in black horror, there is a pressing concern over whether white people as a demographic are consuming this elevated black horror media based on and in black life within the full scope of its exploration, or merely as a source of cheap exploitative entertainment and heightened spectacle on both blackness suffering trauma and monstrous whiteness inflicting pain and terror upon black people. And also, does the uncanny whiteness within these horror simulations distance white people from their own real-world complicity and negligence of widespread black pain and trauma? Is the catharsis had within the artistic pretense of black horror an absolving exercise? Obviously, each horror film considers these questions in different ways, as does the audience, but given the many nuanced horrors that black people have faced and continue to face within our shared social and political reality, there is a lingering doubt, a disturbing shifting in the mirror, the surprising ways socially conscious horror and thought-provoking horror might influence real-world discourse. 2021's Candyman confronts these questions and the overall anxiety of the gaze, not only holding up the interrogating mirror to examine the complicity of the external white gaze, but also the internalization of black trauma within the artist's gaze. Our main protagonist, Anthony, is a Chicago-based artist quickly falling from relevance after being unable to produce anything new or exciting for 2 years. The gallery owner is anticipating a new flicker of artistic brilliance that will speak to the black experience in a fresh, enticing way. A way that makes sense to the white gaze eager for transgression, but of course within the colonized boundaries of expression that they demarcate. It's clear to me from the beginning of the film that Anthony has hit a wall, and the only way that he can move forward is to, well, as the white gallery owner says, dig into that history of his. There is also the lingering assumption that if you are a black artist, your art must always have something to do with race or racial trauma, and if not, we're a bit confused. It's almost like the system keeps coercing the black artist to continue offering up stylistic displays of blackness in pain. And if you're a black film director who chooses to step into the realm of horror, it's doubly expected that that horror will give the viewer a spectacle of trauma-filled black terror. Even Nia DaCosta, the director herself, speaks to this.
You can definitely see a trend of most of the black horror films that are made are about racial trauma. So absolutely there are forces that are like, this is what black filmmakers need to be making if they're working in this space.
The very presence of the white gaze can and has historically been extremely stifling when it comes to the creation of black art and black expression. When you're subject to the prevailing white gaze and the market that has the money that you need to make it to production, there is always the question of how will the ubiquity of whiteness encroach upon and influence my own artistic hand? So for Anthony, already insecure of his artistic roadblock and on his way to obscurity, it's naturally time to excavate the not-so-old ruins of Black pain and trauma. You know, for artist's sake. And that brings him to Cabrini Green, a ghost of a community that once was, and there he finds the horror he needs. Basically, he finds his meal ticket. And perhaps a side note, although not really. But either way, I'm not sure if the film does this on purpose or is self-aware of this. I feel like it is. But Anthony's art is, to me, kind of lame in the first place. Like those earlier paintings of Black people sporting nooses around their necks like gold chains. It's so lame and played out to me. Like, we've seen visual evocations of that sort of like damn near a million times before, and even when they were new or quote unquote fresh, they weren't even that compelling in their artistic narratives. So I'm just sitting here like, that's the art these white curators and gallery owners were praising Anthony for? That's the art that put him on? Alright. Girl. Okay. I mean, damn, the mirror piece that he eventually comes up with, it was actually more interesting than that shit that put him on. I mean, still kind of tacky and kitschy in a way, but more striking than that mess that, again, originally put him on. Which really just goes to show, a lot of these white hoes who have the money to put towards the production of Black art don't really know what's good beyond superficial evocation. Which is why, for me personally, I'm sorry to say, well, that's a lie, I'm not sorry to say, but for me, white criticism of Black art of any form is always very secondary, very much an afterthought, very much back of the bus, if you know what I mean. Like, it's there for my consideration, and I'll read or comb through it if I'm bored from time to time, but And yet, white critics and white outside observers can always peer inside to eagerly theorize and construct their own mythological understandings of the horrors and violence that can circulate within Black communities and be rendered within Black art. And because the system favors the word of whiteness, their mythical construction is taken as gospel, even if most of those theories are off base and insular in their consideration. The weight of the white critical word has the power to cut off a Black artist's access to the means of production and showcasing, just like the weight of white constructed social mythologies has the power to uphold the perpetuation of systematic anti-Black violence. Systematic violence like the gentrification that has gutted the neighborhood of Cabrini Green. The ways Black pain and suffering are mythologized through art is often such potent stimulation for spectators, and not just white spectators either. The murders that occur after the showing gives Anthony's new piece credence and currency. It's as if the only way to make Anthony's artwork tangible and relevant is through the violence that sensationalizes it. Again, making it new mythology by exploiting old wounds that clearly haven't healed, but have now been ripped wide open. It's both a dedication and a desecration, I guess, in the ways that art can sometimes be. Depending on the spectator, that is. And it's all in the name of this trauma that, as we find out, reaches all the way back through time and now has come to visit again through a mirror via the reflection of our gaze. And really, what else is mythology other than a reflection of our society dispersed throughout history? Making a mess, of course, per usual. And Anthony's art piece is a clever way to consider the ways Black artists and Black people altogether are looped into these cycles of mythological reification. But even in that systematically coercive collaboration, there is still an inkling of resistance in the artistic appropriation of this violent history. Even the title of Anthony's new art piece, Say My Name, it evokes the rallying protest cry of say their names. Well, actually it was originally say her name before it was adapted into their and his and so forth. It's this robust assertion that we remember those unjustly slain by violence workers in blue, by the system that is perpetuated. A dignified remembering that echoes throughout history, centuries back, because that's how far back this will to defiant survival reaches. However, and in part because of the twisted nature of systematic coercion, Anthony's new artistic relevance pushes him to immerse himself more and more into the darkness this mythology and artistic evocation has unleashed. He is obligated to internalize the collective trauma of Cabrini Green and the various iterations of this history for the sake of his own growing renown and public image. He wants to do an entire show dedicated to Candyman and Cabrini Green, which again includes the gentrification that made it such a nurturing hotbed for Black trauma. I mean, the repetitive iteration of the definition of gentrification that happens throughout this film is somewhat irksome. Like, we get it, like we don't need constant explanation. Let the visual imagery relay that already obvious element in the story, you know? But nonetheless, I do like the clever use of gentrification as this parasitical and diabolical infestation that mutates the body of a community, much like that bee sting that gradually mutates Anthony's body. It's a form of systematic violence that slowly corrodes the community, stripping it of its humanity and dynamism, in order to replace it with something that seems more sturdy and stable from its exterior appearance, yet the depth of its interior extends from a space that is rotten and destructive. Again, which mirrors Anthony's physical degeneration throughout the film, in which he is slowly infiltrated and taken over by the ghostly matters of not only Cabrini Green's history, but a whole history of interconnected trauma and violence. And as we see, it's an infestation that wreaks havoc on not just the body, but the mind and spirit as well. So for white supremacist institutions and entities to then fix their scrutinizing gaze upon the devastating symptoms that come with the systematic infestation of gentrification that they themselves have designed, and then to have the caucasity to apply lame, victim-blaming interpretations of that Black social degeneration, how could that not breed an intense cultural and communal resentment? Anyone or any community subject to such a crazy-making cycle of abuse bears witness to the manifestation of terror. It's not mere suggestion, nor do they need a mirror to reflect back the history of trauma and violence to know deeply when terror has entered the room. The reality of it sits within their very being, even as it goes unvalidated by the masses that consume it and regurgitate it back up as kitschy provocative art or a fun summoning game. The character of William Burke, portrayed by Coleman Domingo, let's move on, is definitely a testament to this. The nature of how the phantom of Candyman permeated fear in the neighborhoods he haunts is tantamount to the hounding surveillance, interrogating scrutiny, and dehumanizing brutalization, policing in parts upon many Black neighborhoods. Fear being concentrated in Black spaces already ravaged by the greedy, consumptive hands of whiteness creates an atmosphere in which violence and terror is allowed to reverberate backwards and forwards throughout time. Past being prologue and all of that, effectively corrupting any progress for the future. The most interesting character in the whole film for me was Teyonah Ferris's Brianna, and her storyline, her history, her internal history of trauma. That trauma mythologized through art and her father's suicide. It's something that both deeply frightens her to the point that she makes efforts to distance herself from it at every turn throughout the film. She almost wears that trauma on her wherever she goes. And it matches something that William Burke says in the film's final act.
When something leaves a stain, even if you wash it out, it's still there. You can feel it, thinning deep in the fabric. This neighborhood got caught in a loop. The shit got stained in the exact same spot, over and over, until it finally rotted from the inside out.
And we can't forget about William's trauma as well, as this sort of human monument to the cycles of terror that have assaulted his home, his community. And we do see the destructive toll that that has on him, and how he's driven to act out this ritual of violent transformation upon Anthony as a last-ditch effort in reclaiming his community's dignity. William's degeneration gives credence to the generational passing down of this terror, matching Brianna's inheritance of trauma through her father's suicide. And that trauma always seems to catch up to her like a persistent ghost. I mean, again, trauma, especially when it happens to you at such an early age as it does for Brianna and for William, is pretty much a haunting. And even while steeped in her trauma that is only exacerbated by these new circulating murders, she does a lot of emotional labor in her relationship with Anthony. And then she is again made to bear witness to someone she loves being disfigured and monsterized by this deep well of violence and terror. Black people bearing witness to the unspeakable horror of traumatizing violence and left to spread the word of it. It evokes the African oral tradition of our ancestors. This film attempts to flip that idea of Black people being left to drown in the terror of a haunting eternalized by systematic abuse and displacement, and instead positions it as a way for the underserviced and neglected Black communities to gain access to that haunting and use it to its own benefit. And that aspect of the film I liked a lot. It's the most interesting aspect of the film. It's just unfortunate that the progression towards that idea does feel a bit rushed, and then right when the concept is manifesting itself and becoming solidified within the film cuts off, and we don't really get to explore more of that. Until the sequel, I guess. Still, I will say, even though the film cuts off way too abruptly for my liking, it's a very evocative ending that sat in my mind for days after viewing the film. So, although honestly on the other side of that, it also kind of overshadows the entirety of the rest of the film. And I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe a bit of both. What I will say is that the ending experience Brianna has in bearing witness to this radical reappropriation of Candyman is that it strengthens the relevance of her own personal story in the film. So maybe this is precious beginnings towards something bigger and bolder and more ambitious for the future. And that dark promise is as evocative, if not more, than the gimmick of the mirror summoning game. The nature of reflection is expanded to a more ambitious and transgressive level. As Helen Lyle, the protagonist of the original film, says herself in those archived tapes, the intoxicating idea that something can be lurking in your reflection is a mainstay haunting. And here in this film, there is indeed something dark and horrific lurking behind you, waiting to take you or overtake you. This addition to the Candyman mythology utilizes the evocative power of the mirror's reflection as an indictment. It's clearly not a coincidence that a great majority of Candyman's victims are white hoes, from the gallery owner to the art critic to the white mean girl clique that bullies a black girl. They are all rutted and gutted by that good old hook, giving them the same consideration of mercy and justice that he received when he met his end. None. Candyman's resurrection represents a grisly, radical addressing of those terrors that have gone unaddressed and without justice for so long that any hopes for peaceful reconciliation has curdled into a ferocious appetite for sweet revenge. Taking the means of that haunting violence and terror into our own hands is a form of protection and justice. A horror icon for the people. We love that. Again, this is a horror you negligent whites have nurtured for centuries, and now it's back with a literal vengeance and purpose. In another way, too, one could consider the ways in which black people, black artists, are primed into becoming martyrs in the face of all of this trauma and horror, in hopes that the veneration via sacrifice will be enough to bring some sort of balance or a justice that will wipe the stain of trauma clean. But I wonder, how will playing into this cycle of horror and death restore any of what was lost? That question considers the moral dilemma in how real-life black trauma is represented and consumed through art, how it's talked about through art criticism, how it's sensationalized through news and media, how we evoke it in our everyday lives through suggestive, seemingly inconsequential games and folktales. Again, it's one of this nation's most potent commodities of sustenance, and has been from its very beginning. And that could be a question for this horror series moving forward, maybe. for, possible sequels, because there always seems to be a price to pay for righteous reclamation. I mean, as we see, Anthony is the sacrifice necessary for this reappropriated weaponization of fear. How will Brianna's loss and the resulting trauma reverberate throughout the universe of this film? Again, it brings us back to the idea of the mirror as an indictment, our reflection ripe with the tension of suggestion. What has history done to us, and what have we done to history? And this movie basically ends with, well, we've reached a new era, one that will surely bring about even harder, more nuanced questions. Altogether, Nia DaCosta's direction is the star of the show. She's game. She really, really is. There are some thrilling visual moments all throughout. Like the set pieces in which Candyman slaughters his victims are quite slick and stylized, some more interestingly rendered than others. I think Nia DaCosta is also very cognizant of how she handles the violence, especially the violence that is depicted upon the black characters. Like, even though horror is essentially about the visceral aestheticization of trauma, she carefully considers how can we use horror's conventions and transformative power to innovate upon horrific expressions about the root of trauma in a way that can be potentially even more chilling. Those Kara Walker-esque paper cutout puppets are a great example of this. A useful visual tool in specifically giving black viewers that needed emotional distance without grotesquely exploiting the deeply shared trauma of that historical violence in a way that might pull us out of the immersion. And it still holds that frightening, kitschy horror element that works alongside this film's prominent exploration of aesthetics, as well as the mythological nature of this particular story. So again, thoughtful, compelling direction from DaCosta. I just wish the script itself more matched her command, because honestly, even in its radical reappropriation of terror, it's at times a bit too passionless and slick for the subject matter it contains, for my taste at least. It's also a little sparse and again a bit rushed in my opinion. But in terms of the film's frights, I didn't find it terribly horrifying beyond some pretty well-tuned and chilling sound design. And because, as we know, sound design in horror films is so vital. Oh, actually, the most horrific element in the whole film, for me, beyond its weighty thematic context, was the fucking bee sting that grew on Anthony into this gnarly, spiritual flesh infection of shit. I don't even know. That was, not much makes me squirm quite like body horror that involves skin infections and bumps and lesions and holes and shit. My trypophobia was acting up, sis. That's for sure. But beyond that, I think more so this film is interested in making the audience feel the horrific historical weight of this story, especially if you happen to be a black viewer who has a knowledgeable and spiritual connection to the history the film is evoking. And I only say that because I've unfortunately come across many black people who do not know or connect to the reality of our history in this country. It's always jarring when it happens, but yes, it does happen. And really, that reality in and of itself speaks to the nature of the system's efforts to make us forget and ignore the blood-soaked anti-black terror that is literally baked into this country's system. But the paper cutout puppet short story that plays over the end credits blatantly, plainly, and painfully says it all. This nation's history of racial violence has been caught on a horrific loop for far too long. Just like that cop at the end of the film who weaves his own convenient narrative of pick your own story options for what happened that night. He doesn't inquire about Brianna's experience or offer her any semblance of concern as a supposed civil servant meant to protect and serve. Brianna's vulnerable state seeped in trauma is instead merely a tool to protect his own position and the power of the institution he works for. He's literally myth constructing in real time, and he gets his ass sliced and diced because of it. Candyman's hook was certainly sharp that night, baby. But that is the history of violence white supremacist systems, like our supposed system of justice, stays pushing under the rug at the cost of black lives. Candyman said, nah, that's over, bitch. Hell nah.
Tell everyone
That last line does pack a punch, and it was certainly great to see Tony Todd as the iconic Candyman yet again. This marks an exciting step forward in the right direction, although as the film abruptly ends, that enticing promise of radical reclamation still remains a suggestive shadow left shifting in the dark. But damn it, what a compelling and surprisingly hopeful artistic evocation, defiantly asserting Black individuals and communities to step into the radical, terrifying process of taking back full control of our art, our expression, our history, and for damn sure, our future. Love that. Now, the other film that I wanted to talk about here that shares Candyman's obsession with radical transgression is a recent film festival hit called Titane, released by Neon. Neon be doing it up, baby. Neon Pictures. Recently, y'all been, they might be surpassing A24 at this point, but you know. But first of all, Julia Ducornau, the director of this film, is a beast of a film director, truly. I mean, I already kind of knew that with her first feature, Raw. If y'all haven't seen Raw, girl. Give it a go. Viewer discretion advised, though. The entirety of that film still lives in my mind rent-free. Oh my god. But with her second feature, Titane, the Palme d'Or winning film, Julia sweetly sets viewers' minds aflame with a new fever dream experience that is one of my favorite films of the year. And it just might be one of my favorite films altogether. To give a brief spoilery synopsis of the film, spoiler warning obviously whenever I'm talking about a film or a TV show or whatever here, you can bet that there will be spoilers aplenty because I'm going to get all up into it. But yeah, a synopsis of this film, Titane follows Alexia, a car show dancer who moonlights as a serial killer and is impregnated by a car, only to then disguise herself to escape persecution for her murders by going incognito as a fireman's long-lost son. Yeah, that's the basic plot. But there's so much more on this film's mind than just serial killing and car fucking. Yes, she indeed fucks a car. You heard me correctly. And is impregnated by said car. And it's quite the scene. But again, beyond all of the more outre elements of this film that have become a striking marker of a Ducornau film, this is a genre-bending movie about love. Unconditional love. I mean, I don't just want to boil it down to just that, because there's also a lot more going on here. But that is its essential foundation of all of the film's culminating elements. This twisted trajectory towards unconditional love. As I'm sure you've guessed from that synopsis, this film is a bit of a wild one. It kind of feels like a wild animal in desperate, raging, clawing search for its mother, only to find solace in something else entirely. A film that truly has no problem shattering expectation and convention. I have trouble classifying this film as a horror, although just like her previous film Raw, there are definitely many horror elements at play here. And like Raw, Titane is explicitly visceral and confrontational in its transgressions, the way a good horror film ought to be. But truly, Ducornau's films are proudly, monstrously multitudinous. You can definitely forget about putting a Ducornau film in any kind of distinct genre box. Titane is at one point a deconstructive serial killer saga, and then a darkly humorous family drama, with glaring flickers of body horror. Its fluidity reifies a thematic necessity for change and transformation, and our protagonist, Alexia, is the central vehicle influencing that necessity. Among various tattoos about her body, it's the one framed between her breasts that seems to exclaim its words written in bolded black. Love is a dog from hell. It articulates a lot. And perhaps the film's overall thesis statement, if we have the audacity to give it one. Similar to its predecessor, though different in its articulation, this is a furious film, and so much of that fury comes from the main protagonist's immense frustration over the limitations of the human body, of a gendered body, of an aging body, and of course all of these socially ascribed meanings and conceptions of identity that comes along with it. The inconvenient vulnerability of the body, its susceptibility to the influence of disease, its inevitable decay, the ways the body seems to always be in flux, slowly morphing in ways that we can barely notice in real time until we notice, and then it becomes something to contend with. It's almost kind of like the body is in constant, sly rebellion from our own mind, our own protective understandings, and that rebellion embodies a sort of out-of-control monstrosity. Julia Ducornau's two features really capture the depth of trauma and horror that comes from living within the confines of a human body and dealing with that human body. The nature and subject matter of Julia's films, especially Titane, make even more sense when you read that her parents worked in medical professions in which they were regularly up and close with various human bodies on a daily basis. Her father being a dermatologist and her mother being a gynecologist. And in a Vulture article, she talks about how her parents used to talk about their patients at the dinner table and how that gradually sparked her fascination with the human body. So the conception of a character like Alexia, who we first meet as a child, mimicking the sound and force of an automobile, it's as if she can connect more deeply to what it means to be a metallic machine on wheels, rather than the confines of the human body. Right off bat, we know that Sis has a thing for cars, and that her parents, particularly her father, seems to more so deal with her than love and care for her, and perhaps her strange obsession with cars has to do with that distance. In fact, the times that he is in the film, Alexia's father seems to be repulsed by her, wanting as little to do with her as possible, and certainly isn't interested in spending any time with her than he feels is necessary. Like, he barely even looks at her. So really, we're kind of clued into the fact that fatherly love ain't there. And the motherly love kind of comes off as passive at best. Earlier this week, I was watching an interview with Julia Ducornau, and she spoke about how most people will say that Titane is hard to watch because of the disturbing violence it portrays. But she insists that instead of the film being hard to watch, it's more so hard to feel. And the retching violence and body horror within the film works perfectly to embody and confront that idea. It's certainly hard to feel, much like the mess of feelings leading up to love, like being vulnerable and taking the risk that may very well result in us experiencing pain. It's hard to feel and trust that feeling. It often makes some people squirm and cringe with unbearable discomfort that makes them violently recoil from the immersive possibility of love. And through the transformation of Alexia's physical form, we experience the formidable depth of that discomfort, especially as her physical state becomes more incoherent and distorted. And that incoherency begins when she transgresses beyond merely killing people, including her parents, to cosplaying as the hopeful resurrection of a fireman's long-lost son. And Fireman Vincent, he on some shit as well, because he knew damn well when he first set eyes on Alexia that this person was not his son. He knew damn well. But just like Alexia, who was living in a world without love to the point that loving affections feel like prickly threats, Vincent has been living without what seems to have been the most important and maybe only source of love he's ever had for a while now. Both Alexia and Vincent are using each other as a means of escape in divergent ways, but escape nonetheless. Vincent's form of escapism is twisted in a way for sure, but it's also bent on a desperation to rectifying a loving relation that was lost, and I can't imagine the pain of a parent left to the mystery of their own child's disappearance for years, literally a decade. So who knows how that has affected Vincent interpersonally. But he's really just content to have someone to embody the loving memory of his son. Alexia's need is much darker, but her need is just as pressing and urgent. Just opposite of Vincent's need, which we see when Alexia sets her home aflame and locks her parents inside. It's a chilling divergence of events that leads up to their strange union. Once Vincent accepts Alexia in her purposefully distorted form as an embodiment of his unconditional love for his long-lost son, they both effectively enter into a journey of startling change. And it's a journey they both struggle with in various ways. They are bewildered by one another, their divergent dispositions, their personal secrets and lifestyles. But in their mutual escape in one another, they are subject to a mutually immersive experience, not unlike the anxious immersion the viewer feels during that self-inflicted nose-breaking scene that builds a horrific anticipation. Alexia literally commits to the brutal destruction of her own body, the explicit othering of her figure in a desperate move to liberate herself from persecution and the monstrosity within herself. But that aesthetic othering also draws new suspicion and scrutiny, as we see with many of the firemen under Vincent's care. It's clear that one of the firemen in particular, Rayon, has a son-like protection over Vincent. And when this intruder that he, like most everyone else knows, is not actually Vincent's son, begins to supplant Rayon, we see how Rayon's love for Vincent as a sort of pseudo-father puts him in the line of fire. Literally. It's almost as if Vincent has to kill this pseudo-son figure in Rayon in order to accept the reality that he is indeed deluding himself, even if this delusion is saving him from a debilitating emotional destitution. Vincent's fiery murder of Rayon for his suspicion of Alexia/Adrian at first seemed like the sacrifice necessary to exorcise the ghost of Vincent's son, which would then allow Vincent to arrive to a new level of acceptance and thus healing. However, really, it's just Vincent mirroring Alexia's earlier rage-fueled violence at the failed promise of love. Vincent isn't accessing a path to healing when he kills Rayon. He's literally digging the hole of escapism even deeper by killing someone who clearly looked up to him like a father. That's not acceptance. But hey, you know, the road to healing and love is often a bit horrific and messy as fuck. It's a process. What can one say? I mean, I don't think most of us are out here murdering people, but, you know. Ultimately, love is about embracing the will to grow and change, embracing the strange, transgressive, and sometimes even horrifying transformation with another person or community. And often, as a society, most of us instead view love from this patriarchal conquest viewpoint of duty and obligation that often leads to people committing horrific deeds to give tangible definition to their affections. Again, like Vincent killing Rayon, in order to sustain their anxious escape into another person that is spurred by that desperate need to give and receive love. I think a lot of people, and I don't have any sort of basis for measurement on this, but I do think a lot of people think the ability to love is just inherently within all of us as humans. And in some ways that impulse towards wanting love is there for sure, but also the exterior expression of love towards other people is a practice, especially when we break down the different kinds of love. Familial love, friendship love, romantic love, neighborly love, platonic love between the genders, and much more. But in this film, Julia Ducornau is purposefully resisting the boundaries of those love categorizations to explore the idea of unconditional love from a mutated yet loving gaze. And again, Alexia is the central confrontational site of that boundary blurring throughout. Perhaps there is something in the grotesque vulnerability of the human body that makes us so attached to clean, neat dichotomies, while also aching for the transcendence of love. Dichotomy is safe, a convenient barrier that allows us to escape from the scary unpredictability of transgression and the vulnerability that love demands. I mean, just think of what it takes to get to really know and deeply love another person. There's so much troubled land to traverse together before a loving faith and mutuality can even begin to bloom. It takes so much time and patience and so much energy and attention and introspection and reconsideration and recontextualization and the decluttering of faulty communication, and oh my God, it seems never ending because really, it is never ending. Again, it's always in flux, always morphing in the subtlest ways, much like the human body. This film embodies more than any other that I can immediately think of or remember anyway, the reality that love, deep for real love, is not for the faint of heart, body, spirit, or mind. To once again quote bell hooks in All About Love, acceptance of pain is part of loving practice. It enables us to distinguish constructive suffering from self-indulgent hurt. When love's promise has never been fulfilled in our lives, it is perhaps the most difficult practice of love to trust that the passage through the painful abyss leads to paradise. And Alexia don't be trusting nobody. She be ready to stab motherfuckers, preferably in the ear. When we first meet her, she is emotionless and cold and so distant from her humanity from the very start. But she can imitate affection, which she regularly does in order to kill. She uses intimacy to coax people in for the kill regularly. It's almost like the heat of affection and love is too much for her to perceive as anything other than a threat, and so she must extinguish the source of that arousing flame before it becomes an unbearable burn. It's like some death drive type shit. And sometimes that's what the exhilarating feeling of love can feel like, an out-of-controlness that makes you dramatically impulsive, especially if you have no understanding or basis for a loving practice or a loving ethic. Which Alexia certainly does not. Again, she out here fucking cars and shit. Oh, and killing motherfuckers. It seems as if the only thing that is able to withstand her passions is the metallic construction of an automobile, with metal highly resistant to heat and coercion that has high tensile strength alloys. Yes. Whereas human bodies and their various representations seem to be like symbols that stimulate a libidinal desire and disgust in Alexia, which may very well stem from the lack of loving stimulation she grew up with in her home and with her parents, again particularly with her father. So maybe the killing rampage Alexia is on is an extreme form of acting out that, well, to quote bell hooks again, a way to articulate ongoing rage at the failure of love's promise. Who knew I would be quoting bell hooks so much while talking about a film like Titane? Again, we can sort through all the different kinds of love. The film considers familial love the most, I think, because that is the usual central source from which we derive our first understandings and first experiences of love, or not in Alexia's case. And within Alexia and Vincent's bizarre, constantly morphing relationship, there is that concept of found family, a second chance that also presents itself with a new challenge. But even with that familial love angle, the unconditional love Ducornau is exploring here doesn't really have a definitive label that we can make sense of. We just know that it is an instinctive need that comes from a central and shared human place, an impulse, really, that is both animal and something else, perhaps spiritual, and even intellectual. But the point is that love stretches beyond any of those comfortable constructs or labels. The nakedness of love, the extreme vulnerability of it. There is an element of horror in that kind of love because it obliterates all of the petty concerns and leaves us exposed and hoping against hope that even in our flaws, our divergences, our abnormalities, and even in our old decaying bodies, even in our gender-defying bodies, that we are still deserving of unconditional love. So I originally said this film is essentially about the ferocious journey towards unconditional love, and that's true, but it's also about change and the necessity for transformation, and within that idea, there is also a compelling deconstruction of patriarchy sneaked into the film. From the beginning, that one shot that introduces us to grown-up Alexia on the job as a car show dancer is a progressive evolution of the audience's gaze. Throughout the film, the nature of our gaze shifts dramatically, but in that one shot alone, we get I guess like a spiritual foreshadowing of that overall shift that will happen once we've reached the end of the film. I love the way Ducornau even flips the normative idea of a man seeking out someone to take care of all of his needs and a woman seeking out the emotional solace of love. Here, it's the tough-looking fireman on steroids who is desperately seeking out the emotional solace of love, while Alexia is the one using that desperation as a source of sustenance. But there's another key scene that reminds me of another quotation from Bell Hooks' All About Love in her chapter on mutuality. And it's the scene where Alexia/Adrian, well, in this case, I guess I'll say Adrian because the other men of the firehouse believe him to be Adrian, a young male, and a part of their dispatch team, even if some of them still have their doubts. But the scene I'm talking about is the moment when Alexia, as Adrian, dances on top of a fire truck during a firehouse party in front of all of the other guys. Her dance is sultry, and it elicits a feminine sexuality expressed through this otherwise masculinized bodily representation. She dances with the vehicle similarly to the way she does with the car in that aforementioned introductory one-shot. It's a great scene that is also layered with some comedic notes, but ultimately, at this point in the film, it's a full display of herself, a physical sharing of her passion in which she feels comfortable enough to finally be open with her newfound family community. Whereas in that introductory one-shot, she is only somewhat of an aesthetic display on the same level of those beautiful model cars. Here, though, Alexia is truly vulnerable, extending an expression of herself she would have never shared before, and instead of being met with the acceptance and love that she has been so bereft of for pretty much her whole life, she is unfortunately met with a painfully familiar, blistering silence of scrutiny and suspicion. Her dance in this context stands as another glaring confrontational transgression from the confines of the representative body that she is in, well, that she is embodying. It's a transgression that even challenges Vincent's earlier declaration of unconditional love, which was really just another attempt at maintaining his escape. And that scene reminded me of the quote from All About Love where Bell Hooks notes, "I saw how little support men received when they chose to be disloyal to patriarchy." Like, everyone in the firehouse has been so ready to finally have Adrian express himself, and once he finally does, and it fails to link up to his exterior, they are paralyzed with trepidation and disgust. That dance embodies a vulnerability, a sensuality, a relinquishment of the protective shield of power and domination that is such a distressing affront to the patriarchal gaze that even witnessing another perceived male body express himself within that realm of risk leaves the men dumbstruck. It literally shuts down the party, so to speak. It's a simple scene and setup, but within the radical context of this film, it hits harder than it ought to as a powerful, active rebuking of the prevailing patriarchal conceptions of love in which it merely becomes a structured means of escape and avoidance. But it's when we get down to that final scene, the birth of the car baby we've all been anticipating, that both Alexia and Fireman Vincent's trust in one another is challenged under truly urgent and transgressive circumstances. That final scene, girl, that final scene is quite something. Like, wow, what a moment. But yeah, that final scene truly encapsulates the messy, unwieldy, ugly, gross, intense nature of the frightening praxis of unconditional love. For me personally, there is even an element of prayer in that final scene. There's a sacredness to it, a sort of holiness that reminds me of religious iconography. From the music to the physicality of the actors, how it's choreographed, how they hold on to one another in these wild, needy embraces. There's also an energy of liberation to that final scene. One that asks, how can Alexia finally liberate herself from monstrosity? As horror reveals itself, how can we remain faithful and courageous? The birth we witness is truly rebirth, a second chance. Ducornau herself, I think, spoke of it as a shedding of skin. Alexia, by giving birth to this baby, this car baby, she effectively sheds her skin and becomes newly baby vulnerable as a naked baby fresh from the womb and at the full mercy of the world, and the man she is immersed in this experience with. And for Vincent, this rebirth brings forth a second chance for him as well, as a father. For him, it's like the birth of a new hope. Well, honestly, yeah, truly it kind of is. After all, a birth of a child is regularly symbolic of hope for the future, and in this case, it's hope for a new evolution in humanity that makes us both stronger and more resilient of body, spirit, and mind. It encapsulates the necessity for societal change that, as we discussed prior, we tend to shrink from in fear and anxiety because the confines of our society as it is now does not encourage or really want that change, because that radical change would require a complete overhaul of how we operate as a society in general in order for us to truly embody that unconditional love ethic. But change is necessary for evolution, and evolution is necessary in order for us to build towards a possibility for a future. The evolution of the body must be in mutuality with the evolution of the mind and soul in order for those second chances to even have a chance at being fruitful. And it's in that physical, mental, and spiritual toiling that the aesthetic abnormality can be reconceptualized as a valuable and necessary part of loving the wholeness of another human being, no matter their aesthetic representation. So contrary to the film's dark and monstrous beginnings, we end the film with a beautiful, beaming sentiment about the transformative nature of love. There is mutual transformation, so how could one of us ever look at the other and perceive them as monstrous or deserving of persecutive scrutiny? We are divergent, yet our need for love is forever the same. Perhaps a simple sentiment to some, but as the film interrogates, the intricacies that lead to love are never as simple as we like to think. In an interview about the film, Ducornau insists, quote, "We don't love the other for their qualities. We don't even love the other for what he/she is. We don't even love the other for what we would like him/her to be. But we love the other because he/she is there, and because it is him/her and me, and that is all. And we can't really explain that. So flames of destruction evolve into fires of passionate, unconditional love and affection. Titane smashes right through comfort and boldly embraces monstrosity in a way that reminds me of a quote from one of my favorite aforementioned horror films.
Today we need to break the nose of every beautiful thing.
It's a dramatic way to say we have to defy death by embracing even the ugliness of humanity, of each other, of art. And I think I've talked about this before, but art is one of the main ways we humans do that. Artistic pretense is the main way we defy the darkness and horror of death. In the film, it's achingly clear that fireman Vincent fears death, his own decay, and perhaps it's the immense love that he has for his son, and then this stand-in for his son, and then eventually with courageous clarity, Alexia, that acts as the thing that can sustain him and keep him from crumbling completely. That's true humanity. Art is often a labor of love that creators put out into the world with bravery, hoping that love will be accepted and maybe even miraculously reciprocated. So I'm sure the Palme d'Or is fantastic and a boon for a film director's career so that they can continue making their work, but there's nothing quite like fans loving and deep diving into your art and embracing it fully. That's the true loving practice that sustains the artist and primes them to continue defying death via creation. And love is so necessary in order for that practice of creation to be at its very best. And really, loving practice is itself an artistic expression. So much like the film insists, there ought to be no boundaries between them. Let's continue to broaden the spectrum for the sake of ourselves, our humanity, and our future. But I've been consistently coupling this film with Bell Hooks' All About Love, which I don't know if Bell Hooks herself would necessarily approve of. But honestly, after viewing this film, I immediately connected it back to All About Love. Surprisingly, it does carry a number of key philosophies from that book. I mean, not all, but enough that it's significantly contextual. So I think it appropriate to end my little review of this bomb-ass film with one final quote from that book that I think about sums it up. Intensely connecting with another soul, we are made bold and courageous. Using that fearless will to bond and connect as a catalyst for choosing and committing ourselves to love, we are able to love truly and deeply, to give and receive a love that lasts, a love that is, quote, stronger than death. Again, we out here defying death, baby, and Julia Ducornau is certainly creating films stronger and bolder than death. And as such, she is officially one of my favorite film directors doing the damn thing right now, especially after this one. Titane, a beautiful beast of a film with a big, bloody, beating heart from a beautiful beast of a film director. And I cannot wait to see how Julia defies death and horror again in her future projects. It's time to talk briefly about Evil. Chill out, y'all, it's a TV show. Evil on Paramount Plus is a, quote, psychological mystery series that examines the origins of evil along the dividing line between science and religion. The series focuses on a skeptical female psychologist who ends up joining a priest in training and a carpenter as they investigate the church's backlog of unexplained mysteries in an effort to assess if there is a logical explanation or if something more supernatural is at work. The show was created by Robert and Michelle King, the pair behind the hit TV shows The Good Wife and The Good Fight, and various others like the short-lived Brain Dead and the pandemic-inspired The Bite. I really enjoy the Kings' work, The Good Wife and The Good Fight being two of their most successful gems. But Evil really is something special and quite different from their other television endeavors. It is a procedural, but the central plot of the show allows that familiar procedural muscle to be stretched beyond its usual bounds. Like one week it can be a medical procedural, and the next week it can be a cop procedural, and we even get a law procedural as well. But it's never just one thing. It's always gleefully mutating right when we feel like we can pin it down. And this continuously mutating monster of a show is eager to explore the many complicated contours of evil from a spiritual and scientific basis. The show is steered by an engaging trio of main characters with divergent perspectives. Kristen, the skeptical psychologist, David, the black Catholic priest in training, and Ben, the carpenter and technical expert, all working together to decipher the many horrific and strange what-the-fuck mysteries that I have seen presented on television in some time, pretty much since The X-Files, which is also a clear source of inspiration for Evil. It takes the X-Files' central concern of belief and the ever-shifting concept of truth and dramatically expands on it. Watching the first two seasons, well, really binging them, which I rarely ever do, I never knew what the fuck the show was going to morph into and explore next. I could never anticipate what it was going to throw at me from episode to episode. And the nature of that enduring mystery is so endlessly thrilling and genuinely surprising in how it tackles contemporary social issues and anxieties and seamlessly mixes them with the horrific and supernatural. For example, there is one episode that explores zombies and its origins in Haitian slavery, while connecting that history to the contemporary concern regarding worker and union suppression. And while the show isn't particularly scary, I do find its central concern to be rather disturbing. And I find it disturbing because for a while now, I've been sort of unnerved and distressed by the ways that, as the show explores, the ways that evil is so adaptable and how it can innovate through so many seemingly innocuous and pedestrian things, such as the technology that we use every day, and even through other people that we love and care for. The idea that evil is planting seeds of discord within things we normally wouldn't give a second glance, as a gateway from which more evil can enter into the world. And this isn't just a religious anxiety, it's one we all have as humans, particularly in this country as Americans, who are pathologically insecure of our national and personal security. This enduring insecurity that has its origins in early puritanical roots. And our insecurity around security speaks to this enduring fear that our society will be infiltrated and supplanted by some foreign entity or evil, which only then justifies us spending exuberant amounts of our national budgets on defenses and weapons, just in case. And how that justification for insecurity only ushers in more evil into our world. and also the ways that we ourselves are not aware of the ways evil is influencing us in our own beliefs, manipulating us in our own faiths, be it ecclesiastical faith or faith in logical sciences, both of which still embody human limitations and prejudices of understanding. The show explores how evil, or even its suggestion, keeps us in this vicious, self-perpetuating cycle that injects chaos and confusion into society, to the point that both faith and science fail to adequately provide satisfactory answers to our most poignant problems and grievances. Which just means the show has an endless, deep-ass well of inspirations to pull from. You know, I've always been of the opinion that faith and science work well together in the search for clarity. They sharpen each other, they make each field of thought more thoughtful, and keeps them honest via constructive conflict and scrupulation. And that's the main thing I love about this show, amongst the philosophical debates around science and religion, and the various ways that the show uses supernatural horrors and social horrors to explore the uses and faults of both faith and science, their limitations and their advantages, especially when used together to get to the bottom of our deepest, darkest mysteries. Evil also has a wicked sense of humor about its very serious and sacred subject matter, about this perpetual tension between science and spirituality. But it's never disrespectful or cruel in either direction, and if anything, it uses that absurdity to explore just how bizarre and strange so many of our fears can be. The first 2 seasons are so compelling and so fun and are available on Paramount+. Altogether, a great television watch for the Halloween season and beyond. Unfortunately, I have not been reading anything like horror related this month, but speaking of profound talent in artistry, Michaela Coel has recently released her first book titled Misfits, a Personal Manifesto. Now y'all already know how I feel about Michaela Coel. This is one of my favorite creators out right now, truly and duly. And I am once again recommending to everyone her magnum opus, I May Destroy You, the best piece of media to come out in 2020. Please go watch. Every human being on this earth should watch it at least once. I mean, I'm pretty sure I viewed it probably beyond 20 times by now, and the shit still hits, truly. But here, in this little book, Michaela weaves a vulnerable narrative that explores her personal, turbulent journey to artistic expression and its enduring necessity in an industry that too readily nurtures a thoughtlessness and a "it is what it is" disposition that engenders us all towards a culture of awkward complicity and neglect where there should be empathetic consideration and concern. This short manifesto is pretty much a padded printing of her 2018 McTaggart lecture at the Edinburgh TV Festival, recontextualized and expanded through Michaela's unique perspective. Before Michaela's lecture, I had never even heard of the McTaggart lecture, but apparently it's a big deal, a pretty big deal for pop culture and entertainment, basically for TV creatives in the UK. To be invited to give that lecture, well, it apparently means you are a fresh voice that a lot of people are paying close expecting attention to. And there is a damning pressure to that and an eager curiosity in that attention. Anxiety. And Michaela touches on the effect of that anxiety and its various sources within and outside of the industry, and perhaps most potently within herself. Michaela is a Ghanaian woman from a working-class London family who finds herself in an industry dominated by white middle and upper-class men. She was the first black woman to ever give the McTaggart lecture, the first black woman to win the aforementioned Emmy Award for Outstanding Writing in a limited series, but most importantly, she is a misfit and will likely forever be within the context of the industry she occupies. And for her, proudly so, because that position gives her a unique perspective both in her artistic expression and storytelling, and in her worldly outlook. Quote, "The term misfits takes on dual notions. A misfit is one who looks at life differently. Many, however, are made into misfits because life looks upon them differently. So the application and withholding of meaning and worth via the absence of distinctive definition. Within the context of our world, misfits are very much prone to being subject to interpersonal abuse, their willingness to transgress beyond boundaries, stimulating in many a sort of confusion that they just can't help but pick at. So misfits like Michaela Coel become prime targets for their lack of perspective. In the book, Michaela details her experience in regularly being the lone black pupil in her schools and universities, and the resultant bullying and racial abuse that she frequently confronted. Quote, "We would fight. That was our way of expressing our mistrust and fear of those who were visually or culturally different from us." Michaela also details how so much of this baggage was somewhat of a stimulant that propelled her in her journey towards artistic expression, in which she would constantly defy definition, even with so many personal assaults aimed her way for simply having the audacity to transgress beyond described boundaries. How she was the only black girl in her school's history to join the Irish dance team, and she says she killed it. I know she did. How her study of the Bible led her to becoming a poet who embraced LGBTQ+ misfits instead of denigrating them like so many others in her Catholic school did. How she would continuously say yes to fear-inducing leaps of faith that others regularly judged her for, but would actually propel her towards newer, bigger opportunities for creative expression, giving way to gems like chewing gum and Again, I May Destroy You. As she grew up, she realized her status as a misfit was more of a boon than anything, and was actually becoming a hot commodity, her divergent perspective fresh grist for the entertainment mills. Yet even within her newfound success and renown, Michaela notes various instances in which her newfound residency within UK's entertainment industry came with plenty of battles over authentic creative expression. She noticed a recurrence of negligence, one that seemed to be more readily nurtured within the institution than the few misfit artists it was newly inviting into its house as a haven for creation. And she noticed also how it made that house unstable, which would invariably affect the artists charged with revitalizing the industry. Quote, "I've often been told by people in our industry that many producers and many companies test the waters to see what they can get away with." Michaela notes after giving a very telling anecdote about a time in which the production company of one of her shows had 5 black actors crammed into one trailer while a lone white actress occupied her very own. Michaela also details how she found herself slowly, quote, "merging with the mainstream for a feeling of safety" after the success of her show Chewing Gum. "My euphoria from being liked made me so happy. I was suddenly fitting in. Oh, everyone wanted to be my friend." However, she also notes the alienation she experienced after realizing that she had not adequately transcended her distinction as a misfit within the industry. Quote, "Sometimes being a misfit hurts. I can recall rummaging through a gift bag for my first mainstream award. It contained dry shampoo, tanning lotion, and a foundation even Kim Kardashian was too dark for. A reminder, this isn't your house." Throughout this short manifesto, Michaela plays around with the symbolism of the moth, presenting its mysterious shape and nature as a sort of emblem of the misfit. She notes, "Moths are predominantly nocturnal creatures, preferring to be active in the dark, pollinating flowers at night just as butterflies typically do during daylight. Considering this preference to roam in darkness, it's surprising that moths find themselves circling around the very thing they typically avoid, light." The symbolism of the moth is one that, much like the status of the misfit, inspires conflicting meaning for many. To some, the moth embodies a bad omen, one of unease and darkness, a morbid symbol of doom and even death. Meanwhile, to others, the moth is a spirit guide, fluttering in a cloak of darkness, seeking out hidden knowledge, embodying psychic wisdom and even shadow work. Michaela specifically mentions her interest in the African death's head hawk moth, of which visuals are scattered all over the book and used as chapter breakers. This moth, contrary to its intimidating and repellent outer appearance, in which it sports a pattern resembling a human skull upon its back, is actually quite harmless. It's also one of the few moths of its species that is able to create sound, a mere high-pitched squeak, but a defense mechanism nonetheless, and its only real defense mechanism against predators. One of the most disheartening and life-changing experiences Michaela writes about and again publicly spoke truth to during her McTaggart lecture in 2018 was the experience of complete isolation after realizing she had been sexually assaulted by strangers one night. Quote, "How do we operate in this family of television when there is an emergency? Overnight, I saw them morph into an anxious team of employers and employees alike, teetering back and forth between the line of knowing what normal human empathy is and not knowing what empathy is at all. When there are police involved, and footage of people carrying your sleeping writer into dangerous places, when cuts are found, when there's blood, what is your job? When the narrative of climbing makes others put profits before people, fitting cheap cladding into their tower blocks, what then? How many other potential artists with stories we want and need have we lost for the sake of financial profit? Have we lost to thoughtless education systems, thoughtless nurturing thoughtlessness? Basically, a lack of consideration to how a healthy foundation is imperative to the overall structure of any project. For example, another example Michaela gives is how writers, the essential starting grounds of any project, too often get the short end of the stick when production budgets are low, script editors and overlookers scrapped in favor of putting money towards the visual aesthetic rather than reinforcing the foundation. And as Michaela notes, this is a reality prevalent beyond just the entertainment industry, but instead of all of our governing institutions and systems in which healthy foundations are regularly sacrificed in favor of the cheap cladding of flashy aesthetics and symbolic artificialities. And as such, societal integrity atrophies just as artistic integrity does. Yet even submerged within systems that routinely failed her and that led to various disempowering horrors, Michaela has never been interested in attacking people in retribution for her experiences, but she instead invests in attacking the ugly limitations of their ideas and how they contribute to unnecessary fragmentation that only makes the systems they are all subject to dangerously unstable and inequitable. Michaela considers to herself many doubts that tip into questions that tease at personal epiphanies about her history and the tentative nature of her profession as a writer. I find myself sitting with pain, with darkness, she writes. How long, I begin to wonder, has my habit been to recount horror with a smile, standing in the light recalling tales of darkness? It's the kind of question one often stumbles upon when writing from a place of uneasy vulnerability, and even more so if you yourself, the writer, will be vocalizing that vulnerability, dripping with unease and alive with transformative meaning to a crowd of your peers. And she asks herself still, how am I able to be so transparent on paper about rape, malpractice, and poverty, yet still compartmentalize? It's as if I were telling the truth while simultaneously running away from it. And even if you're not a writer, I think most of us living in this world can find something to relate in that. Compartmentalization is a defense mechanism I think many of us utilize in order to just get by. It's a form of mental separation from trauma and discomfort, and also just a useful tool in organizing our lives. However, one that can ironically contribute to many of us undermining our own convictions and morals, which can potentially lead to cycles of destructive behavior that make our environments all the more unsafe. And also, as I think I've mentioned before, extreme compartmentalization can be a surprisingly destructive segue to mental illness and overall emotional disconnection. So I also appreciate how Michaela likens this compartmentalization to a moth attempting to fit in with the butterflies. Quote, I wondered why, if 95% of us didn't fit something, we would encourage each other to aspire to it, to emulate it. The easy allure of the butterfly does not really challenge us to perceive deeper beyond our own perceptions of worth, meaning, and beauty. Now, that doesn't mean the butterfly is of less value than the moth, or vice versa. It just means that they are divergent in how they similarly contribute to the shared ecosystem that they both inhabit. And it is worth noting that there are indeed many more species of moths than there are butterflies. The sectors that compartmentalize and dichotomize struggling creatives and misfits and high-powered producers creates an uneasy field of artistic collaboration and diplomacy, leading to unnecessary anxieties that estrange the sectors of the industry and creates a faulty system, a faulty house. And how can great art be nurtured within that space? Artistic integrity relies on the bravery of the kind of transparency that Michaela Coel is at the forefront of, so that the industry can come together to create the best stories possible. I mean, that's clearly what happened with I May Destroy You, a show that I will never, ever shut the fuck up about. The way we could get more pieces of art like that, art that is that challenging and that stimulating, if industry and societal transparency allowed us to integrate our morals and our integrity with our work, instead of separating them into anxious divisions. I think there is a lot of wisdom in Michaela's hard stance on transparency above all else in her creative endeavors. I personally find the way she speaks about her process of creation very meditative, kind of like a prayer of sorts, which is very nurturing of the self and of the story that she is servicing. There is a cyclical giving and taking of energy that gives way to a sense of respect and mutuality. So really, it's no wonder that Michaela considers her stories like her babies that she must look after until they leave the nest as complete and whole projects. And even just being someone who works in the entertainment industry, a job in which you essentially come up with flashy lies, artistic pretense that, if created well with integrity and attentive skill, will err on the side of truth. It's finding balance in the practice of using fiction to reveal something true, which is, what any good artist works towards after all. A mutuality of consideration that we encourage beyond just the righteous artifice. And in this way, Michaela's artistic bravery and call for industry and societal transparency is genuinely inspiring, and it may actually be our only defense mechanism to save us from societal and moral atrophy in our contemporary moment. And within that journey towards transparency, we can all find for ourselves a like-minded tribe of misfits to help carry and sustain us through years of personal disempowerment and dejection. Quote, "My friends were all misfits," Michaela writes. A huge gang of commercially unattractive, beautiful misfits who found the mainstream world unattractive. From the outside, we were difficult to distinguish, but on the inside, known by name and nature. Misfits, a Personal Manifesto by Michaela Coel is a small book full of big ideas and a lot of spirit. A defensive squeak amplified into a loud and clear clarion call for righteous radical honesty. What can we say? Sis is certainly ahead of her time, and I am waiting, hoping that the rest of the world can catch up to her fearless vision. Alrighty, the horror is finally over.
How many people were scared? Me too. I was really, really scared.
And you made it. You are that final girl. Congratulations. Not everyone can claim that title. We all envision ourselves to be such, but most of us are either a random victim of the bloodletting or the killer altogether. So, yay for you. Hell, yay for us all. Hell, I'm the one who stood up here doing all the goddamn talking. But listening to is a labor, one I appreciate from you guys. So again, thank you. And per usual, I hope you got something out of my many mumbling ruminations, and if not, well, I don't know what to tell you. But yeah, y'all know I had to crawl out of the woodwork for a moment for a little bit of a Halloween special, if you will. That, mind you, was literally recorded last year, during last year's Halloween. Literally, I spent the bulk of this past year trying to recover the files of that recording because they had somehow been corrupted. I don't even know. And I was so distraught. So distraught. But, you know, now here we are with, you know, most of it intact. Unfortunately, some of them still are corrupted. Like I had, in addition to the ramblings that I was doing here, I also had a long ass, like 3-hour long ass review and deep dive into Mike Flanagan's Midnight Mass. That series threw me to the wind. Unfortunately, the file is, like I said, still corrupted, of course. Fuck. Which is quite annoying because if I do say so myself, that was a good, thorough, and spirited review and deep dive of that show. And it really deserved, because it really is a rare thing that we get a series as thoughtful and as thrilling as Midnight Mass. So yeah, if you haven't seen it, Midnight Mass, it's on Netflix, bitch. Get into it. So good. And it's very timely for this current moment in our history as well. And obviously ideal for the Halloween month and beyond, really. So good. And lastly, I did leave a little list of my favorite horror films in the podcast description, along with a few other things, all horror related, obviously. Check it out, and, you know, I hope you have and or had a wonderful, safe Halloween. I shall be back, likely at the top of the next year, with more current topics. And, you know, I'll be honest, the next visit here at HomeBodyMedia is not likely to be a very nice one. Yeah, I'll just say that. I have a lot to say. But until then, per usual, stay diligent, stay thoughtful, and stay cautiously open until we gather ourselves here at a later, less spooky date. Goodbye.